where the real problem is.
Good evening, everyone. It is Tuesday, August 13th, and I'll call our work session to order. Our work sessions are informal, and we go directly to the items on our agenda. And the first item on the agenda is the maximum tax levy, 2014 budget discussion. And presenting this evening is our city manager, Heather Johnston, who will kick it off, and then to Kelly Stray, our finance director. Ms. Johnston.
Madam Mayor, members of the council, thank you. As you all know, but for the public's benefit, today is our maximum taxation discussion. And we have to certify, as Kelly will tell you shortly, what the maximum tax levies are. You'll have to make that decision by mid-September, and we have a September 3rd hearing scheduled for that. What we're going to talk about today is really the different pieces, components that go into those levies. We're going to spend a fair amount of time talking about the levy limits as well. You all have heard about that. There has been some differing interpretations that we want to make you aware of, but feel free to ask questions as you go along. I'm sure Ms. Dry would be happy to pause and answer any questions to make sure that it's clear. We'll also be talking a lot about the Infrastructure Trust Fund levy for our streets and parks, and Mr. Albrecht is going to help us out with some slides here at the end to try and bring all of those different components together for you. So with that, I will turn it over to Ms. Dry to begin the presentation.
Thank you.
Thank you. Madam Mayor, council members, as you all know, we're in the middle of our mini budget meetings that we have throughout the year. We began back in June with a discussion of preliminary budget pressures, and in July we discussed debt planning at length. And then today we're here to discuss the proposed maximum tax levy. And coming back, as City Manager Johnston said, we'll be coming back September 3rd to have the council adopt a maximum tax levy. In October 18th, we'll be releasing a video. We did this last year in place of our budget open house. It's a virtual budget open house. Will be available on our website and on community TV as well, going over a lot of the things that the city does in all the different departments and where the funding goes. And October 29th, the department heads will be back in front of you at a work session to present also the things that they do in their departments and the challenges that they're facing. In November, we have 2 work sessions that are very detailed on the budget, where we go through, on the first work session, the general fund and all property tax supported funds. And then on the second one, November 26th, we look at capital projects, the CIP, and the enterprise funds. And then that brings us to the final meeting, December 3rd, where we bring to you a final budget to adopt. As I mentioned back in June, at the June 11th work session, we brought you a preliminary budget with some big picture numbers, where our pressures that were coming and where we were thinking that we might have some challenges. Since then, the department budget or city department heads and their staff have been working diligently on going through all of the detail in each of their budgets. We have about 50 budget preparers that are working on the budget. It takes them about a month and a half on that detail. They're looking at trends, and they're looking at actual costs and those kinds of things, where they are going to propose to be using their funding. And that brings us some of the numbers that we have for you tonight. It gives us the big picture numbers, but we will still be putting those more detailed numbers together after over the course of the next couple months. You will get a final workbook on November 1st for your review, and that's what we will use in those 2 budget work sessions in November. The maximum tax just provides a ceiling for the amount of levy that the city can levy. So we have to say that the levy will be no more than a certain amount. and that's what we're coming to you tonight. There's also levy limits in place this year, and we'll talk more about those in a couple of slides. So back in June, the council provided us some preliminary direction to stay the course on the 5-year financial plans that we had in place for our infrastructure trust fund and some of our other funds. We had projected a 6.9% increase in the tax levy, and since then, we have revised that down to a maximum of 5.7% increase, and that's due to some revised revenue estimates and some of our other types of revenues, and some changes in use of fund balance, some tweaks here and there. So that is how we are now at the 5.7% increase.
Ms. Story, in that 5.7, that includes the shift from the TIF district?
It does.
Yeah,
It
so that's good for, and you'll be getting into that so people will understand that's already existing taxable value that's just going to be transferred from one pot to the next pot, the general fund pot.
Yes, Madam Mayor, we'll be addressing that with several slides on the Infrastructure Trust Fund.
Excellent. Councilmember?
Because we have people watching and they might
Yeah.
depart and not get the rest of the story.
Yeah.
Whenever we bring up this 5.7 and the impact of that 1.2 or whatever it is, could you point out, Ms. Stray, that what the net impact is to existing? Because that's really what we're talking about. I don't want anyone to walk away thinking we're starting out at 5.7% in a tax levy, max tax levy. What percent of that, or what does the percent look like after you factor that approximate 1.1 or 1.2
Yep.
of the TIF district decertifying? So whenever you state the 5.7, you also follow up with the net effect to existing taxpayers at this point is X.
Right now, we are showing the net effect to parcels already in the general tax base as 0.8%.
Yeah.
Okay.
What it is.
So
It's a
0.8. So
0.8.
what all of us and the people looking at home who already pay a certain tax levy and paid one last year, we're talking about a net change of 0.8%.
Point.
The rest of the 5.7 is all fresh money from a decertified tax district that is being put into the pool, but it has to be counted the way we book things in government as part of the tax levy increase.
And also some new construction.
Yeah, you can almost just call it's all new money. It's as if we just grew our tax base by that, because that's in effect what we did. We just did it many, many years ago, and it didn't count till now.
And Madam Mayor, Councilmember Keeley, we are, Ms. Stry is going to get into some detail on that, and we are confident that the viewers will find a lot of really great information here tonight.
It is.
We'll
It's
stay
very,
tuned to get
very
the right-
good.
I know it's all in there. I just know that some people watch Channel 16 and then walk away and then come back, and they may hear one and not get the rest of the story. That's
We
why
have
I
it
wanted
broken
to.
out in a number of
Great.
different places,
Thank
so.
you.
Yeah, and the nice thing is that staff is going to also have this on Channel 16. There will be, so it'll be played and replayed also.
Thank you.
We had a lot of discussion about levy limits at our last meeting in June, and they had just been passed by the legislature. They were brand new. We have found out some additional interpretations from the Minnesota Department of Revenue regarding levy limits, so we're going to share those with you tonight as well. First off, just a little background. There's two kinds of levies. There's the general levy and special levies. And special levies are generally for debt and a few other things. For us, it mostly means debt service. The levy limits do not apply to the debt service levies. That allows us to pay the debt that we have already been committed to, and so the legislature does not put a levy limit on the debt service levies. So those are subtracted out as we calculate that levy limit. The legislation provided for 3% growth in the base levy before special levies. And there is also a factor in there for subtracting out any increase in local government aid. And we do get a little bit of local government aid this coming year for the first time, about $85,000. It also provided a floor for that debt levy limit, or the levy limit, pardon me. And so once you do the 3% calculation, you compare that to your 2012, 2013 levy. And if that levy is higher, then the levy limit, the 3%, that you get to have a levy limit of that amount. What was assumed at that time was that floor was the special, or was the general levy from the prior year. What the interpretation of the Minnesota Department of Revenue is now is that is the total 2013 or 2012 levy, so including the debt levy. So that provides us actually a much larger levy limit than we anticipated, because you can compare just your general levy to the total levy from last year. So it results in an additional $1 million on our levy limit. So that is why we can go above the 3% under the levy limits. And we're actually, what's proposed here is $164,000 less than the levy limit that is allowed. Is that clear as mud?
Yeah.
Maybe to us.
Yeah.
But
Well,
it is difficult for the layman
Yeah.
to pick up on
Yeah.
this because it's a lot of tricky
Yeah.
language they're not used to.
Well, and
It's
when
the-
you're talking about levy limits,
Right.
and you're talking about the ceiling and the floor, if you don't live with it like we live with it, or if you're in business and there's business language about a certain way of doing business, if you're not living in that environment,
It's Greek.
Yeah.
If you don't live in it.
yeah.
It's really easy
But-
for most of us, especially for,
I think at the end of the day, all the residents want to know is, what is it that's going to,
what's the net
Net, for
cost
me.
to me?
that's all.
Yep.
Yes.
Uh,
Jan?
I think it's worth being said at this point in this discussion, that what we are doing, and I'm speaking to our general audience and the people who voted us in office, when we have $1.1 million come in off a decertified district, many people out there will say, great, you can lower my taxes because you have all this money that
Yeah.
you didn't have. And if, but not for, the fact that we have 10 miles of degrading roads, which we've heard a lot about in recent emails, to put this money into helping repair those roads. But if not for that, we might be discussing what would we do with this, and we might be discussing a reduction in the levy because of that money coming into play. But it's pretty clear to everybody, if they've paid attention, but not everybody is, people tune in and out now and then, that we long ago had decided that it was in our best interest as a city council and for the city to put this money into the ITF and to fund the degrading roads from the late 80s, early 90s, where there was some material issues.
There
and-
was more than
and
that,
were-
because we did not fund it for 2 years, if you remember.
Yes, we're almost backfilling
We're
through some troubled
backfilling.
times, and we knew that we had a growing road condition problem over the last 2 or 3
Yeah.
years, and we were looking for any opportunity we could to be able to put some more money into it to correct it. And I think that the citizens and the taxpayers want it, as evidenced by many who are emailing us right now, is they would like these roads repaired. And this is what we are talking about doing with the money, instead of, per se, offsetting other costs that might be driving it.
Well, actually, we need to put it in the infrastructure trust fund so Steve can manage all of the roads that really need to be reconstructed and rehabilitated, and then we can find ways of fixing the 10 miles of really degraded roads from the savings. But
Yeah.
he'll talk about that
Sure.
later.
I
But
think of it as
I just want people
it's
to
a pot of funds that Steve is going to figure out a way to best
Yeah.
spend to fix the road problems in general, whether it's the 10 miles or the existing plan. It all is a need.
Yeah. And it's, thank God we have an infrastructure trust fund.
And Madam Mayor and council members, I'd like to point out too, it also is a very similar use to how it is being used currently. The TIF funds are currently being used for capital
Yeah.
road projects. We've funded the improvements to County Road 42 that have occurred over the past 4 or 5 years. And also, we're using a large portion of our funding for County Road 5 and 13, those TIF funds as well. So this is a similar use. Had we not had those TIF funds available, they would have required general debt levy So that's just one more thing to consider on that. So as a result here, the numbers that we're proposing for the 2014 budget for the general fund is skipping down to that fourth line, the infrastructure trust fund levy would go up $1.1 million to $3.1 million, and that's a 4% increase to the total levy. So that represents 4% of the 5.7% total increase. Other funding plans that we have, our debt levy would remain constant. Our EDA fund would go up $25,000, and that has been in your EDA 5-year plan for a number of years as well. And the Emerald Ash Borer plan is increasing $50,000 a year, and that's for management of the Emerald Ash Borer problem that is coming our way. And that leaves 1.4 in the general fund levy, which also covers some transfers to some of our capital equipment replacement schedules. Another way to look at the comparison from this year to last year to this year, the green bars represent the general levy, and the red portion on 2013 represents the taxes that we collected from TIF 2 that represent the city portion. If you, one point of clarification on the TIF, we have been collecting city portion and county portion. The county portion will go back to the county, but the part that we're talking about moving over to our levy is the part that represents the city portion.
We already paid the school district.
Yes.
Yeah. The school district we usually pay.
And they will get a portion of
yeah.
it too that's smaller than. So, and if you compare in 2013, the green levy that we collected plus the TIF 2 city portion, you can see that it's a much smaller increase compared to a total levy in 2014. Another way to look at the change would be what is represented by current level of services. We are proposing about $220,000 for current level of services, and that is offset by $225,000 savings in sales tax this year because of the new legislation that exempts cities from sales tax.
Boy, is that nice.
Finally.
Boy, is that,
that is
came at a
Finally,
nice
since
time.
1992, it
Yeah.
was supposed to sunset.
So
It
we're
actually did. That's a miracle.
Only 20-some years later.
Yeah.
again, the infrastructure trust fund is $1.1 million increase, and then all of those other adopted plans, EAB, the Economic Development Authority, and some of our capital plans representing 0.9%. This is what you were talking about, Councilmember Keeley, the parcels, who's paying this increase. The parcels that added value from new construction represents about $210,000. So we had some new properties come online into the tax base. The TIF 2 parcels that will no longer be in the TIF district, but will be in the general tax base would be $1.1 million. Those are approximations of that number. And then the existing general tax base, we'll see about 0.8%, 200,000 spread to the existing taxpayers.
Wow.
It's very
Would love to see this every year.
yeah.
That's nice.
How will this affect an average property? We always look at the average residential, and then we look at the average or a $1 million commercial. This slide is the residential. I just want to take a moment to talk about how the tax levy is spread. You as council have control over the total dollar amount that the city levies. Then that levy is spread to the properties within Burnsville based on their individual values. So it's a pie. And you get a portion of that tax levy based on what proportional value your property is to the grand total of properties in the city. And we generally think too, there's residential properties and there's commercial properties. And if everybody's value is changing at the same rate, so if every property in Burnsville went up 2%, then the tax levy increase would equal the increase on an individual home, because everybody's value goes up the same, so you maintain that same proportion of the pie. But that's not what happens, and over the years it kind of changes back and forth. This year what we're seeing is that residential properties are increasing faster than commercial properties. So the average of residential properties are increasing at about 3.6%, and the commercial properties were very flat, right at zero. Many of the commercial properties staying exactly the same as what they were last year. So when that happens, the residential in total is taking on a bigger piece of the pie, and so they're also getting a bigger piece of the increase. So that is something you don't have control over, but it is one of those factors as people are looking at their own individual property tax statements. Why if the levy went up 5.7%, why does mine go up a different amount than that? Something also factoring in this year is the county does all the valuations. They determine the assessed value of each individual property. We are seeing a large variation of change among residential properties. So there are a lot of residential properties that actually went down in value, and there are some that are around the average, and there are some that are significantly more. And it kind of seems to be neighborhood based as well. So there's they've just gone through and done a lot of re-evaluating of what the properties are. So we have a wider range this year, and so it'll be more difficult for people to look at this particular average home might not look like what your individual property tax
Bill?
statement does.
And just so the folks understand, assume that it's just a real true 1.7 net increase. Those numbers still apply because the homeowners will be paying more than commercial properties because their homes increase in value, and then unfortunately they have to pay more of that 1.7 net increase if that ends up being the net number, correct? So when you say 5.7%, but the real net, for this hypothetical or this discussion, the real net increase is 1.7%, and those same numbers would apply to that.
That's correct. So if this slide has this hypothetical average home based on the median values of homes in Burnsville. In 2014, the median value was $191,200. That same home would have been valued at $184,000 last year for a 3.6% increase. If you apply the tax rates that this max tax would have, that would mean approximately $30 increase to this home per year, or $2.50 per month. So about 3.8% increase. We also always calculate a $1 million property, and this is another hypothetical $1 million commercial property. And as I mentioned, most commercial properties did stay very flat from this year to last year. So we're looking at a 0% valuation increase. This property would actually see a decrease of $56 per year. And that's a 0.6% decrease. We had talked in June about use of fund balance, general fund balance. These projections that we have tonight include the Ice Center debt transfer of $140,000 from fund balance. That is the third year of a 10-year plan. You have set aside, actually assigned in your fund balance an amount to cover that for the next 7 years. Also, elections expense is covered. We covered that with use of fund balance as well. Because we have that every other year, we have approximately this amount. We try to take the swings of that up and down out of our tax levy, and we use fund balance for that when it is available. And what we are proposing that it would be, that the fund balance is definitely healthy enough to take that 100,000 from election expense. Some other potential uses that we'll be considering as the budget process continues would be capital and other one-time expenditures. In your financial management plan, you have a policy that says we will use fund balance for one-time expenditures. So we would not use it for services that would cause an increase in the next year. This would be a one-time expense, one-time revenue for one-time expense. We'll also be considering youth center improvements and carry forward of any one-time revenues from 2013. We have a few items that have come in 2013 that are unplanned. We may propose to have those cover a one-time expense as well. And then we may wish to consider assignment of some fund balance to replace the host fees that are pledged to debt service because of the volatility of those particular host fees. So we'll be considering that and bringing that forward for your consideration in the budget process.
Will you also be including the local government aid that we're getting this year? It's a very small amount, but it's a small amount for, we had a policy, then we changed that policy because one council member wanted it to go into the general fund. We did it one year and regretted it because the following year we lost it all.
In our projections, Madam Mayor, we do have the 85,000 as a revenue source for 2014.
Okay.
So we did include that. We mainly did that because the levy limit includes that as part of the calculation.
So it is in our
So
general?
It is in the general fund
We have to do
revenues.
that?
Madam Mayor, we don't have to do that. In fact, that's one of the questions we posed to you later. Our rationale
Yeah.
for doing it this way was that we think that it's unlikely, given that the levy limit has this connection to local government aid, that revenue won't come through this year. Now, given the history, and I know that we've been back and forth on this, you all may not be comfortable with that. And so we do pose that to you as a question later
Okay.
on, just to see. I think at this point in time, it's a relatively small amount. As Ms. Strye has indicated, in the unfortunate event that didn't come through, we certainly could put it in the fund balance. We could also reserve it in the fund balance, the same amount, just
Yeah.
in case. I mean, there are a couple of different options that
Okay.
we could do. So we'll pose that to you at the
I just don't trust it.
So we want to have the check before.
Well, yeah, I don't trust having it in the budget for a levy limit, but we'll have that discussion afterwards because,
If it were a
Been down
bigger
this
number, I'd be more concerned. That's not a big enough number to be.
yeah, it's still,
I mean,
85,000 is 85,000.
it is, but
Yeah,
we can
okay.
absorb that. We can't absorb $500,000 or,
Yeah.
what it once was many years ago.
Okay. Also, each year we consider a potential transfer to the fund balance, from the fund balance to the EDA fund. You have a policy in your financial management plan that says we'll address this every year. If there's available fund balance and that it's needed in the EDA fund, we would make that transfer, and we have no planned transfer for 2014.
Okay, good.
As you know, we look at the current year's or the current upcoming year's budget in the context of the next 5 years, and even behind the scenes at staff level, we're looking 15 years out. But we are projecting, based on the revenue trends and the expenditure trends for the next 5 years. So we're not making any decisions in a vacuum. We are considering what that would do to us in the following years.
Mary?
In the past, and my memory may be faulty here, it seems to me we've had a percent change to the levy when we,
Magic, she put it on.
I know, thank you. Okay.
Yep. So we're showing the 5.7% for 2014, and then that drops down back into the 3 to 4% range.
Yeah, Bill?
Just want to anticipate, but over that 5 years too, there's still TIF money that factors into the budget, correct?
TIF money from TIF 6, do you mean?
Yeah, on your projection? No?
No.
So those are real numbers.
Once it's in the,
Once
In
it's
there.
in, it's there.
it's there.
Yes.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah. Once it's there, it's there.
This is basically the same chart, but showing you where we've come over the last several months in these projections. Back in the green, back in November 2013, when you, that would be 2012. November of 2012.
Yeah, Mary?
Well, I'd just like to comment on this because the 8% sticks in my mind because
Yeah.
I'm looking forward. I'm always trying to look forward, and I think all of us are here in terms of, what's like, almost like the worst-case scenario and then what actually happens. And the reason I want to address this is I want to show how staff really, really works hard to grind that down, and my compliments to you.
Yeah.
And I know you're not giving a big number just so you can then have something to grind down. I think you're giving a realistic number. So going out to 2015 and beyond, I see that these are,
Yeah.
again, you're taking a very realistic but very conservative approach to this.
Right.
Thank you.
Yeah.
We're not trying to look at
2014
worst-
reflects the TIF shift.
Yeah.
That's the reason why that looks so
Dramatic.
dramatic. But then what is really nice is that, as Ms. Stray said earlier, and it's been our practice here in Burnsville, is we don't like those shift. We like a stable ship. No big waves.
Yeah.
Stable. So, very good.
And these projections, as you said, are not worst-case scenario projections. They're trying to average
Yeah.
year.
I shouldn't have used that term. You're right.
Oh, no, and yes.
No,
I
you're right.
understood.
Yeah, that's a more precise way to put it. So, yeah, I agree.
It's the best case we know.
Yeah, Heather?
Madam Mayor, members of the council, the other thing to remember is that there were some legislative changes and other things that really did impact that 8.6% too. So we did have some other different pieces, as Ms. Stry has already talked about a little bit.
That's a very good point, Ms. Johnston, for our residents to understand. We are at the mercy of the legislature. The decisions they make have an impact on the way that we do business in municipal government. And so some of the decisions they make have very, very dire impacts. This time, they had a little glitch that they didn't do well, which saved us.
And some positive impacts associated
Yeah.
with the sales tax.
Yeah.
So, and some
Yeah.
other.
Yes. The change between, the biggest change between the 8 and the 6 was the sales tax,
Yeah.
$225,000 savings, which we offset.
Finally, and thanks to the legislators for working that, because that's a big hit on their budget, huge hit on their budget, but good for all of us.
And then some of the other factors coming down from those earlier steps would be revenue improvement. So we're seeing improvement in our permits, improvement in some of our EMS collection rates. We have more ambulance runs and a little bit better collection rate than we had as well. Those are some of the biggest factors. The others would be things that are kind of whittling away at it versus the bigger steps. So, the Infrastructure Trust Fund, we had said we were going to talk a lot about that. Here's where we do that. We use the Infrastructure Trust Fund for the maintenance of our streets and parks, and when I say maintenance, I mean reconstruction and rehabilitation, the long-term taking care of the streets and the parks. The direction that you had given us was to stay the course and put that 1.1 million that we had planned in the 5-year plan since the year 2010. As when that first started to show up in there, it was a little bit smaller number, but as we got a little bit closer to the end, we could tell what that those properties would be generating, and so it's 1.1. That to be offset by those properties returning to the general tax base. The goal to be pay-go for streets has been achieved with that 1.1 in that 5-year plan. So we will not be proposing that we have any new debt in the ITF fund, or these numbers do not propose any new debt. And we also had another positive impact to the ITF fund, which resulted from 2012 and 2013 projects having favorable bids and favorable results. So the fund balance is improved from the last projection that we made on the ITF fund by about $800,000. So that's a good positive impact.
That's good.
It's as Steve Albrecht will tell you as well, that's a factor of the economy and the bids that were received. We may be seeing that changing as we go in the future. We don't know. But in those years, there were some really positive results. And the street condition issues that you referred to earlier in the meeting as well. We have about 10 miles of streets that are failing prematurely due to the materials that were used in the late 80s and early 1990s. It's a metro-wide issue. It's not just a Burnsville issue. It's a factor of what was used. And we have reviewed some options and funding for addressing this issue. On the funding side, the improved ITF fund balance could be used for this purpose, and then also the available funding from proposed increase to the ITF levy. The fund balance that will be shown in the next 5-year financial plan in the ITF will be sufficient to fund either of the two plans that Steve is going to talk about.
Thank you, Kelly. Madam Mayor, council members, before I get into that, we're talking about 10 miles tonight, but you remember back in May, we have roughly 50 miles of street in town that are what we would call ready for reconstruction. 10 of those 50 miles are streets that are ready for reconstruction 15 plus years before they really should be, due to the types of bituminous materials used in the late 80s, early 90s. And so that's the issue that we're going to talk about specifically here tonight. If we weren't to have gotten that $1.1 million, we would be spending tonight just talking about how do we come up with money to make our existing plan go forward. Forget about tackling the 10 miles of streets. It would have been a conversation about increasing funding so that we could just do what our plan had shown. So so it was a big deal that we were able to, number one, get the 1.1 million, and then that we do have some fund balance savings. As Kelly touched on, we don't anticipate the positive bid results to be something that's going to continue here, at least in the near term. What we're seeing right now, the economy, it's a good sign. It means the economy, the contractors have as much work as they can do right now. And so part of that is because when we had a recession, the contractors shrunk in size. There isn't the capacity there was 3 years ago for construction. And so cities right now that are bidding things later in the year, in some cases, just are choosing not to go forward with the projects because of the bids. We're pretty aggressive that we bid our projects very early in the year. We take pride in that. That allows us, by the council allowing our staff to move forward early the preceding year, we're ready to bid early in the upcoming year, and that allows us to get the best bids we can. But we don't want to rely on that as our street strategy, that we're going to use bid savings every year because we don't know that that'll be something that'll continue. So back in May, we talked about utilizing those savings to try to advance some of these 10 miles of streets. And it was approximately 3 neighborhoods, or 2.7 miles, that we talked about. We were looking at a full reconstruction of those streets, basically going through and redoing the entire street. The issue that began to rise out of that is we began to get a better handle on how many miles of total impact there were, and the great number of residents impacted by this. It's across the city. It's not one area of the city. It's literally from one end of the city to another. It's in townhome areas. It's in single-family residential. And so it's across the city. It's a widespread issue of the streets that were built back then. not only as new streets, but streets that we reconstructed back then. Streets that were originally built in the 50s and 60s that we rebuilt in the early 90s are seeing the same problem. So it was truly the specification of the bituminous that was used at that time wasn't meant to last this long without massive amounts of maintenance to be done, and none of the cities had planned that maintenance, and so that's why we're somewhat in the issue that we're in right now. With that in mind, Burnsville historically has not looked at neighborhood residential mill and overlays. Many of our surrounding communities that are a little younger, who have newer streets, they use that as a very good preventative maintenance strategy. Egan did 20 miles of overlays last year. Their streets are younger, and they use overlays as a good way to keep their street quality up at a much lower cost. Overlays anywhere from 70 to 80% less in cost than a traditional reconstruction. So our staff decided to take a look, and we're actually this year on Brookview Drive doing what we kind of call a pilot project where we mill the street, we do very minimal repair to anything else, mill the street, and overlay that street surface. So we're basically removing the top 1.5 to 2 inches of bad bituminous that has started to fall apart, and then putting a new surface on top of that. We believe that we'll get at least 10 years of extended life out of that practice, and what that does is that's important because Burnsville's funding of its streets is set up to have our streets last 40 years on average, plus or minus. And if we can get 10 to 15 years additional life out of these neighborhoods, that's going to get them to their intended life in our plan and allow us to not have to make such dramatic decisions about funding in the future. And so with that in mind, staff believes that probably with such a massive mileage of streets that really need attention, that we should be looking at a mill and overlay approach, which for a nominal additional amount would allow us to positively impact 10 miles of streets and numerous residents in town versus tackling 3 neighborhoods and not knowing whether we can do one more a year or one every couple of years for the next 15 years. And so that's the 2 options that we looked at. As I said, back in May, we were looking more at a reconstruction option, but based on some of the things that we were seeing with our streets this summer as we got out there and got a real good handle on what was happening, and a lot of the feedback from our taxpayers too, we thought that it was prudent to maybe be a little more aggressive with something and try something new. I think if we go to the next couple slides, we can touch on a few things just to crystallize this for the council.
Dan has this question before we move on.
Just as you reviewed mill and overlay versus rehabilitation, what is the net difference between those 2 approaches?
Well, the city currently does rehabilitations on our collectors and our higher volume streets. But we do them when the streets are in a better condition, number one, meaning they haven't cracked up as much, there hasn't been as much damage to that lower level of bituminous. We also do much more extensive curb drainage repair, utility repair associated with it. And so it's a much more intrusive operation than a mill and overlay. A mill and overlay, you're literally in and out within a day or two. And it is looking mainly, and because these streets are only 25 years old, the curb in most cases is in very good shape.
Right.
And we're hopeful that subgrade bituminous, which hasn't started to degrade, is going to be in decent shape once we mill off that surface. But you typically would overlay a street before it got to the condition these streets are, and so that's why we're looking at it as more of a maintenance overlay. We're not sure that it's going to last quite as long as our traditional rehabilitation.
Right. That's good. I agree with it 100%. We all see that in other cities driving around. You see them grinding off the first inch or 2 and then putting in fresh asphalt, and I think it's a right solution to the problem.
Didn't we?
Yep, that's what we use in
Yeah.
our collectors. We do those more frequently on our bigger volume streets. And in those streets, we see the value if we don't let it get too bad by using that. It saves us a lot of money in the long run, and those streets see so much more impact.
The county seems to do that a lot, too.
Yep.
Yeah.
Are-
Mary?
Do you have can you say what the risk will be that you will find that the lower level of bituminous is degraded as well?
The risk really is the life of what we get out of this, and one of the other things that we're not proposing an assessment on this, and the reason for that is we're looking at this as more of a maintenance activity. It's not intended to last. When we assess, we typically assess for 15 years. We don't even know that we're going to get 15 years out of this maintenance activity. And also, these streets would be up for reconstruction in about 15 years, or 10 to 15 years. We don't believe that it makes any sense to assess someone for a maintenance activity, which we don't think is exactly what we would like to deliver, and then right as that activity is paid off, you have another assessment for reconstruction. We don't think that's the right way to do business. We don't think that's fair. And we're also approaching it as a maintenance activity. We're not doing more than we need. We're doing what it takes to put the streets back in good condition for the residents to use.
Okay. Steve, when we use this mill and overlay, after 2 years, what will the streets look like?
Well, we'll touch on that.
Ah,
I've got a
very
slide
good.
for you. So
Because
if
I
we go to the
think
next slide.
that's- yeah.
Before we go further, one of the other things that we looked at when we were looking at why should we do 10 miles versus just the little amount, or the less than 3 miles, is we really, depending on the day and who you talk to, you couldn't have one person differentiate for you what we would consider the best street in the 10 miles versus the worst street, where you were in those. And they all are degrading. And so the thought that we'd only be able to knock off 3 of those areas and then some residents would be waiting 15 years or more,
Yeah.
potentially in those other areas, we just didn't believe that was the right approach. And so I think that was part of us changing. And if Kelly wants to move to the next slide, this is really the difference that you'll see. On the left, you've got a typical reconstruction. 1 to 2 years, we say very minimal, no cracking typically. When we reconstruct, that means we go down, we redo
Yeah.
the gravel base, we redo the bituminous all the way up. Now, one of the reasons that we reconstruct a lot of our older streets is back in the 50s and 60s, they didn't put gravel or aggregate base under a lot of the streets, or it's disappeared over time. Our streets that were built in the late 80s and early 90s, that's not typically the issue that we're seeing. Is there's gravel base there. The issue, and so the base is usually pretty good. The issue is the bituminous material that was used. And in most cases, the curb is still in relatively decent shape. If the curb had all kinds of settled areas, then we would know it isn't the bituminous, it's a subgrade issue in the roadway, not the road surface. So on the right-hand side, what you see there is that's a typical mill and overlay. And 1 to 2 years in, one of the things that you do see is you see some cracking because you're not repairing the whole surface. The cracks that exist in the subgrade bituminous, they reflect through, and so we are very aggressive in sealing that up. The enemy of streets is water getting into them through cracks. So what we typically do within that first 2 years is we crack seal those streets. Initially, it stands out because you see that crack sealing, but it's going to ensure that we get the maximum life out of that surface, and once that crack seal color blends in with the rest of the street and it gets seal coated once, people really don't notice it. And when you compare that street to what most of those neighborhoods are now, it's really not an issue. But that's one of the reasons in residential settings we've chosen not to assess that type of, there's a lot of heartache about paying an assessment and having cracks in your street right away in a residential setting. And so we think that's probably a good a good PR strategy also in addition. And the amount of assessment is pretty negligible in the big picture of what the cost of that project is. So.
Okay. Mary?
I'm concerned that some of the residents we've been hearing from lately are not going to be satisfied with.
The mill and overlay. Yeah.
I think it's very possible. I think that the vast majority will be concerned. I think you will have some at that spectrum who think it should have been reconstructed. And I think what I would say to them is that wasn't necessarily an option to reconstruct all 10 miles of streets. And so we would have
very
had
expensive.
70% of these residents on the outside looking in, and we were making a decision what's going to benefit the most and maximize our investment. And so I know of 1 or 2 that are not going to be happy with this. But
Well, I've
big
driven,
picture, yeah.
I have driven these streets,
Yep.
Yeah.
neighborhoods, the ones that we've heard from recently, and, some of the streets, they look better than mine. And I'm just concerned that they're not going to be happy with the way they look.
I
Well-
think we have to manage
Yep.
those expectations. And if Steve and his staff are clear with them about seeing.
And we're very upfront with our public
Yeah.
relations with them. We say this is not a reconstruction. This is
Yes.
a maintenance overlay, and we send pictures with it and says
Okay,
this is
good.
what you can expect the first year. Understand? We explain to them the situation the city's in and what our options are and why we chose this option. They also typically this isn't the first time that this has been done in cities, and without assessing it, that's another piece too. When cities assess it, that really causes some consternation that you assess it and then that they're much more sensitive to the looks
Steve,
of it.
what if a neighborhood says, we want a full reconstruction and assess us, so now our street is now on that 30-year plan rather than the 10 to get to the, what if the...
We would have to come up with more, the city would have to come up with more
with
money
more
also
money.
because.
And I think
you're
that's
talking
what
3
they
times
need
the
to
cost, yeah.
understand, that if we're going to go to a full reconstruction, that means that because we put in 60%, they
Yep.
do 40. So that means we have, so I think they need to understand all of that. Yes, Mary?
But isn't it possible that if a neighborhood decided they wanted a full reconstruction and they were willing to pay for it?
You could,
Yeah,
they
but
could
they
always,
still-
they could always
the whole
petition
thing,
us.
the
Yeah.
whole
I mean,
100%?
100%.
If they want to pay the 100%.
Yeah, I mean, I would think that if that's an option, that should be.
Well, I would tell you that a neighborhood at any time can petition for any improvement. they
That's
want.
what I thought.
They certainly could come to you and say, look, council, you pick up the piece you were going to pick up, we're going to pick up the gap, and we want it fully reconstructed.
Yeah.
And that wouldn't be 100%, it would be less whatever we were going to contribute to the overlay, and go that
Okay.
route.
Yeah.
I would
But it
tell
is
you
an
from my
option.
interaction with the residents, I don't anticipate, I may anticipate one or two people saying that, but to get a
I
petition of the
agree.
neighborhood, yes.
I agree, but I just wanted, the only reason I want to bring that up is so that the neighbors, the people in these neighborhoods understand that is an option.
Yeah, and I think that's very good for them to see this discussion tonight, that we're being very, very diligent about how we're talking about all of this and what it means to their neighborhood. Bill?
And if you're, and I know this is kind of a guess, just along the lines of what Mary said then, so say neighborhood A, and just take a hypothetical, wanted to do and agreed to pay for a reconstruction minus the maintenance thing that we would
Mill and
otherwise
overlay
pay for. Right.
cost.
So what, give I know it's just a guess, what would a dollar factor be, and what percentage would you think that we'd be paying for?
Well, in these neighborhoods, in a normal reconstruction setting, you'd be paying just under 40% would be in the $2,000+
Yeah.
range.
So it'd be-
So you'd be approaching $3,000
That's right.
plus if you were to petition that. So it'd be a good amount over what our traditional assessment was.
So it'd be 5,000 minus what?
Well, I would say it'd be 3,000. It'd be over $3,000 per property would be most likely the assessment in that
100
ballpark
typical.
for a typical lot in these types
Yeah.
of properties. So, which
And
our
it'll be a
normal assessment
15-year.
right now runs in that $2,000 to $2,500 range, depending on the footage
Yeah.
and things of that nature. Now this year, because we got some good prices in a couple of weeks, when you see the assessments, they're actually going to be lower than we typically have had because the prices were so good this year. But
And Bill, they will be on a 15-year pay.
yeah.
So this is what's available to our residents, and that's what Mary and I were thinking along and saying, if they want to pay for it, it's 100% if they want the full reconstruction and be on the plan for 30 years to be reconstructed again, a rehabilitation and then a full reconstruction.
So what would the cost difference be between a normal assessment of 2,500 and if the property owners all got together and said, we want our street 100% redone, we'll pay 100% of it? What's the 100% bill going to be?
That's what Steve was saying
Roughly.
about.
Well, I think
always said a
what's I heard
$500
Steve
difference.
say is
Didn't
like
make
2,500 to 3, that would be the difference of a mill and overlay cost versus
Well,
No, a reconstruction.
a reconstruction, their portion. But if they paid
I
100%,
see
not
what
40, but
no, I see
100%
what
of
you're
it.
saying.
On a net 500?
It's a 5,000 to 6,000.
Yeah, that's
Five to
right.
six
That's
thousand.
right.
That's what I was
That's,
thinking.
I think, where
Gotcha.
Bill
It's about a $5,000
The
bill.
other thing that we need to make everyone aware is, this is separate from our regular reconstruction
That's
program.
right.
So when they
That's
think
right.
we have money, the city is still going to invest $5.5 million in neighborhood reconstruction next year of streets that are 40 to 50 years old that were built in this. We have some streets next year that are 50-plus years old
Yeah.
that haven't been touched
Yeah.
yet, and that have not just street issues, they have curb issues, they have storm sewer, they have water main, they have sanitary sewer issues, they have significant issues beyond just the street. And so we need the residents in these 10 miles to understand this is the best we can do while keeping our promise to the other neighborhoods that have been waiting all these years for their program and for the area that Mary's talking about.
Yeah,
is.
Mary, because we all hear from them, where is my street
Yeah.
on the plan? And then I would
Right.
send them over to Steve and Ryan so that they'll know. Oh, then they come back, it's 5 years away. Can I? That's the plan. Mary?
Well, and I live in one of those older neighborhoods that's not being redone, I guess because I live on one of those streets, it's very evident to me every single day when I look out there of what we need to do as a community. So this may be premature because I know you're going to be looking at the street plan, the long range and all that. But I know we've had this very lovely surprise of being able to use this TIF money now for our roads. And I know just a month ago, when we were talking at our work session, we were toying around with the idea of possibly borrowing,
Yeah.
because we weren't going to be able to use that TIF money. Should we do both?
What I would tell the council is I would wait to make that decision.
that's not-
And the reason I would say that is what you're doing with this 10 miles of overlay is going to significantly help your program in that it's going to allow streets that are the older streets not to be bumped. Because what we had been
Yeah,
doing the
this
last
is-
couple of years is
mine's
we
been-
would
yeah.
slide one of these types of streets into the program every year just to try to chip
Absolutely.
away at them.
Right.
And so now we will be able to focus on the long-term streets that have been in the program. That alone is going to impact our program in a positive manner because it spreads out that peak.
Yeah.
So we want to evaluate that first, which we've
Okay.
committed to the council. We're going to know by next spring what those answers are. And so before we make a decision about whether we need additional funds, let's see what this additional funding by the council has done. The other part of it that you have to remember too is it's not just streets, it's utilities.
Yes.
So if we're going to go into an area with old streets, we have to now do the water main. Can we, our rates, we've committed that we're going to keep our
Keep our
rates at a
rates.
flat level with an aggressive reconstruction program. But when we add in areas that need sewer and water, now we're going to have to increase
Yeah.
water and sewer rates to keep up with that. And so I think our preference would be, let's stay the course to next year, make that decision next year as a council, if that's something we even need to do. But let's get all the data before you make that decision, because there is an impact to other things too.
Okay.
Bill?
That makes
And
sense.
the other thing I'd worry about is that we set a precedent to sort of answer the call for those folks, and then we have lots of other folks that say, well,
You did it for them.
so you borrow
No, I
money.
wasn't talking about reconstructing those streets, don't get me
Oh,
wrong.
oh.
No, I was
You're
just
talking
talking
about
about,
additional,
I'm talking
other
about
streets,
dealing
the
with
40
those
to 50-year-old
40,
streets.
50-year-old
Yeah.
streets that we
Advancing more of
just
those.
keep,
Yeah.
pushing back, promising and so forth. But now I understand the utilities impact on
That's
that.
why these streets
Yeah.
are in a different category than our standard program, because the water mains are newer, the sewer is newer. We don't have to make repairs to that infrastructure, so there's no impact to our other funds, which allows us to move these around and up without changing rates and things like that. And so that's why you do have some freedom, council.
That's a good point.
Suzanne?
And I would think a lot of my neighbors, I'm in a newer neighborhood, would be happy with
The mill and
having,
overlay?
yes, having at least an improvement with, and not being assessed, and then looking in the future that, as
10
you
years
said,
away.
10, 15 years, then it would be reconstructed. You're going to still have a better street quality.
And to touch on what you're talking about, Councilmember Wynn, we may find that rather than spending more money on reconstructing more streets, it may be that we want to allocate a small amount of money to be doing mill and overlays every year, a little bit of them to streets that age, so that when those last as long as they should. And that might be enough preventative maintenance that we get to where we want to get, and we can get through the neighborhoods that we need to get through, because we're going to get through quite a few of the big ones over the next couple of years. We've got big chunks of them that we're
Yeah.
going to be tackling, even near your area next
Yeah.
year. We're tackling a very large area. And it's tough because those areas, they look different. At first glance, they don't necessarily look as bad as some of these areas, but they're actually worse because they're completely cracked up. But because the bituminous isn't peeling away, the seal coat has stayed on, and so the color is
Right.
uniform.
Yeah.
And so they don't appear to be as bad as some of the newer bituminous areas, but it's all a looks thing. The subgrade isn't there, the curve is
Yeah.
usually in
Yeah.
disrepair and things like
Yeah.
that, so.
Yeah, I know. I think the pavement management plan that we have in place is really a great tool because it allows you to look at everything from the top of what's above the ground and what's also below the ground and what needs to be done. It helps us to keep our cost very even, and we don't have those
We want to
big
get away from spikes, both in the
spikes,
street
both
program, the
street
sewer,
and water and
stormwater,
all of that.
everything.
And so, and that was the idea from the 90s when that was put in place, is to make sure that we have a very stable budget.
I'd just like to ask you you talked about the bituminous mix. This was not the fault of the contractors or the city, you said many other
Yes.
cities. It was like a state standard
We
at the
believe
time?
that, we believe that in residential areas, the type of bituminous design, meaning the type of mix of rock and oil and things that they used, wasn't meant to last the lifetime that cities had anticipated that it would without extensive ongoing upkeep and maintenance. And cities weren't doing that type of maintenance when they paved these streets. And so once those streets got to a certain point without that maintenance, they just fell apart. And so that's what we're seeing happening. And there's quite a few cities that are actually going to the mill and overlay tool to at least stem the tide and then get back into control of the situation. I mean, there are cities like Minneapolis. Minneapolis mills and overlay. That's what they do for the most part. They don't do a lot of reconstructions because they need to hit so many street areas. As I said, Egan, much of their program is mill and overlay. Our city manager got her street overlaid last year, and her street was built kind of in this era somewhat. So.
Yeah. Dan?
Well, I just want to, I'm in full support of the plan. I think it's a great idea. I always wondered why county roads were getting mill and overlaid, and then, several years later, I'd see it mill and overlaid again. I'm thinking, what is this? Why aren't they, doing a full reconstruction? And I've seen it on county roads more than I thought I would, but I'm delighted. I think this is a brilliant plan to address this problem. I've lived on 2 streets in Burnsville that have the top layer peeling and breaking apart and alligator cracking in chunks and needing constant repair. And I know that both neighborhoods would appreciate a street that reflects more of what we try and do in the city than this constant Band-Aid that keeps falling apart every year. So I'm in full support of it. I think we ought to move forward.
And just one other thing that I think it'd be great for our residents, because they asked me about it. I said, why did the city build the streets that way? I said, wait a minute. Developers built the street and then they hand it over to the city, but they have to build it to our standards so that our equipment can go through, and they have to meet all of the standards. So people need to know, because I had a resident who was trying to blame the city building the street. No. You live in a development that was built by a developer, and then once that was done, they turn the streets over to the city, and then we maintain them.
No, they built the streets to what they believe was the best standard at that
yes.
day. To touch on what Councilmember Keeley said, there's another positive to this too, is our street staff right now in this 10-mile area spends an immense amount of time patching on an annual basis.
Yeah.
And actually probably 50% of their staff patching time is spent in this 10-mile area, because up until now, they thought they were probably going to have to keep those streets together for a very long time. And you've seen the skin patches and along, and it creates basically a quilt on the street. So I think that's going to help us with maintenance in other areas that allow the street staff to stay on some of these other areas and work on them too. So I think there's a lot of positive things that we need to evaluate out of this before we make any decisions on additional funding.
Okay. So, members of the council, if I am hearing for Steve to move forward with the plan that he is proposing with the mill and overlay.
Yes.
Okay, very good. I think that's the right direction, and I think it'll make our residents happy, and you can, if there's a neighborhood
We'll
who
work
says.
through it with them, but I think
If
it'll
they
be a
want a
much more
full
positive.
reconstruction, then that's on their dime, and they will know what to do. So, Ms. Strader, Kelly, you want us to be giving you some direction on the max tax?
Yep, so we have some discussion on the max tax, and City Manager Johnson, were you going to take the questions?
Madam Mayor, members of the council, I will walk through some of these questions with you. I think many of these you've actually answered already, and then Ms. Fry and Ms. Hardy can jump in as well if they want to add anything. But we'll just walk through them. We did prepare this consistent with the direction that you gave us in June, and with the revisions that we've talked about to bring us down to the 5.7%. We really, as Ms. Fry indicated earlier, that is actually below what the allowed levy limit is. And we just want to walk through and make sure you're comfortable with the different components as we've discussed them. The first piece is the 4% increase for the ITF levy that would improve the street conditions and the park maintenance.
We promised that we would do that. Members of the council, you're okay
Yes.
with that?
Yes.
Okay. We promised that.
Just under 1%, so 0.9% increase in the planned funding levels for the finance
Yeah.
plans in all of the different areas. Ms. Trias talked about that, the Emerald Ash Borer, the EDC, some of our internal
We also
equipment
promised all of
funds.
that when we cut all of those in the past years.
Okay,
Okay?
I'm seeing five,
Yeah.
all 5 of you nodding.
Yes,
It's sticking to the plan that we promised when we
right.
didn't
And,
make the
and
contributions last.
and the final piece is that 0.8% for increase for current service levels in the general fund.
Yes.
So you're asking us whether we want to direct you to look for any cost savings anywhere, or just accept the
This is the max
0.8%
tax.
increase for the max tax?
Madam Mayor, Councilmember Keeley, we're asking what direction you're giving us to set this maximum tax levies. As we always do, we will continue to look for savings in different areas. And if there are any specific areas in which you'd like us to look, please let us know that. Otherwise, we continue to look to find efficiencies wherever we can.
Great,
Okay,
thank
Mary,
you.
you have,
No, just Heather just
Yeah,
said
she-
something that, because I remember when Kelly started out, she said there are 50 people working
right,
on the
we're-
budget, and they're still
you're
working
still-
on it.
yeah. And
So-
we still have
Yeah.
2 months to grind through all of that.
Yeah. So with that, I guess
Yeah.
I would say I'm comfortable with
With the max tax?
5.7.
Everybody?
With the
As-
footnote that it's
as a-
0.8% to current taxpayers.
Yes,
Yeah, I
absolutely.
think they- yeah.
And that's the maximum
Yeah.
increase in the city budget.
Yeah.
Because I like, that word levy is just,
$2.50 a month
yeah.
to
The-
to the household.
Average
to the
household.
It's
Average household.
4.9% of new money and 0.8, or 5.8%.
0.8% to the
To
existing.
the existing taxpaying base.
taxpayer.
right.
Okay.
Madam Mayor, members of the council, the next question is related to the LGA. Because we have kind of changed our policy back and forth, we wanted to make sure you were clear on how we have included the LGA in the budget in terms of our revenue. We wanted to make sure you were comfortable with this approach. That what we had put here is we could either increase the levy by 0.3%. Another alternative that I think we talked about earlier in this discussion was potentially reserving that same amount within the fund balance, and that would be another way of hedging our bets, if you will.
And one of the things that we've done in the past, members of the council, is that we always put it in reserve and use it for one-time purposes. So it wasn't in the general fund, and when they took it away, we didn't have to backfill. And we changed it 1 year, and the next year, we lost it, and then we had to backfill in the general fund.
How much was that amount? Madam
Was
Mayor, back then?
was 248,
I think it was 330.
330?
I think 330.
Okay,
That's
330,
that's a little bit bigger number to swallow.
yeah.
Yeah, I guess this is
So
a
can we?
fly speck in my
Yeah,
opinion.
but what I want to make sure is that we should have a policy in place. If it gets larger than that, it will have an impact on us on the levy if it gets to a percent. Yeah, or a.
Fair enough. I mean, I think, I see your point, and I
Yeah,
understand your
just-
reasoning.
because it just-
So what if we just, for simplicity's sake,
Yeah,
make a
put-
policy that if it ever exceeds $100,000, then we,
Put it aside for
Yeah.
one
For
time.
one time.
yeah, and that way, then staff
it's
doesn't
gotta
have
be-
to redo all of this. and-
Yeah, and that's what I would like, is
Yeah.
that if it's 100,000, then we just set it aside for one-time purposes, and it doesn't impact our general levy if it goes away.
Right,
That's.
which it will.
Yeah. Yeah, because I don't trust it. It has always been one where the legislature plays with when
Toys
they
with
want
us.
to, yeah.
Madam Mayor, council members, I'm hearing a consensus for a change in the policy. We'll continue the treatment as the way that we've suggested, but then
When it hits
change
100,000.
the policy.
Yeah, so now you
Maybe
have
not.
an indicator. If it ever gets to 100,000,
It's brought back to the council to
it's
consider. at
brought
one
back to be considered, to be set aside for one time. But at least we should have a policy that at 100,000, we review it.
That makes sense.
Suzanne?
Oh, no, I agree.
Okay?
Sounds good.
Yeah.
The next, I think you've actually answered these as well. On the street paving question, does the council prefer staff to prepare levies based on option A or option B? We're hearing option B.
B, yeah.
And then this is a question that I think we have also discussed about consider bonding, and you've heard Mr. Albrecht talk about it, and the staff recommends to wait until you've had a chance
Yeah.
to consider the broader pieces. And so I think we've got our direction that we need for preparing the levies, and with that, I'm going to turn it back to Ms. Stride to talk about, to just go over our the rest of the schedule.
The next meeting will be the next council, the September 3rd, first September council meeting to approve the resolutions for the maximum tax, which we'll prepare based on these numbers.
Okay, very good. Thank you very much, and thank you so much, staff, Ms. Johnston and Mr. and Steve, and And Dana, everybody, thank you.
That was a great
Nicely
discussion
done.
and good stuff. Thank you very much.
Yeah,
Thank you.
very well done.
Thank you.
All right, the next item on our agenda is Mr. Dahl with the website advertising report.
Our revenue.
Marty Dahl is our communications coordinator, and he's going to be talking to us about the website advertising report.
Should Miss Stray stay behind so she can hear how much money is rolling? Because she'll need to do something with it, I'm
With
sure.
all the money. Yeah, he's
Must
going-
not be
no,
too concerned.
Yeah. Mr. Dahl's going to say whatever money gets, it's going to stay in his budget.
Mayor, members of the council,
Yes.
with that great introduction, I'm here back to talk with you again about website advertising.
Yeah.
Just a little introduction to this, just a refresher of where this all came about. In the past, we've sold advertising in some of our print publications. We've allowed sponsorship for different events for our community television programming, and it was by the direction of the council for us to look into website advertising. This was just a little bit of the background, what I just mentioned. So this was a few months now. We've come back to the council. This is the second time. And last time I was here, I was directed to get some more information from community organizations on an impact that they feel like additional advertising sales would have on them from the city. Talking to residents and doing a survey of residents to see what the how they feel about website advertising, and then also get some feedback from the business community, which we did through the EDC in a meeting last April. So this is the obligatory beauty shot of our wonderful website, since we're talking about website advertising. But we did do a survey, very informal survey of community organizations that was responded to by 9 folks. I was hoping for a better turnout. We sent it to about 20 or so organizations. We had 9 of them respond to this survey. From that data, and this was all in your background report as well, 8 of them said that they have seen either no impact or had a positive impact resulting from our current advertising initiatives. 8 also indicated that they would be comfortable if the city included paid advertising on its website. Only 1 indicated they would not be. The only other thing that kind of stands out there is that 2 did indicate that they felt website advertising from the city would have a negative effect on their organization, as it might have an impact on their ability to solicit advertising and sponsorship. Again, very small sample base, but that was the feedback we received from the community organizations, mostly in favor or supportive of this. We also did a survey of the public, again, an informal survey we did on our website that was responded to by close to 100 members. This question that was asked allowed for multiple responses, which is why you're seeing a percentage that equals more than 100%. It's not that I'm bad at math, although I'm the communications person, so you might want to talk to
Yeah, I I saw those.
about the addition. But this allowed for multiple responses, so keeping that in mind, it was very close. It was about a 50-50 split between people that were comfortable and thought it was a good idea, or were not comfortable with the idea and thought it was a bad idea to do website advertising. So kind of split down the middle. Another survey question we did ask was, do you have any additional thoughts or opinions on website advertising? We had received 42 responses on that. 9 were in favor, overall in favor, 18 were in opposition, and there were 14 that said they would be in favor of it if there were some stipulations, and this was the trends of the things that we saw from those that said, well, sure, it might be not a bad idea, but as long as the ads are not intrusive. A couple of the comments talked about having ads in a separate section, not affiliated with certain web pages, such as building permits and things like that were called out. Ensured user security, so they're not going to get their computers hacked because of advertising. Avoidance of a conflict of interest from the city. They didn't want to view the city selling advertising to a certain business as a conflict of interest. And then allowing for Burnsville businesses or nonprofits only to advertise on the website. As I mentioned in April, we also did talk to the EDC. The feedback we received from them on behalf of the business community was, again, they weren't necessarily in favor or opposed to the idea. Some of the things that they thought were, if the ROI makes sense, what does it hurt? only if it causes no opposition from businesses or other civic groups, which was some of the data we tried to collect through those informal surveys. And they did also express that concern that advertising could be perceived as an endorsement or a conflict of interest with a business. So after all of this, and after our meeting last December, I was actually contacted by some representatives from Google who had seen this story. They actually saw it in the Star Tribune when it was covered. And they approached me with the idea of, has the city ever considered working with them on advertising? And they're hoping to pilot a project with public entities and nonprofit organizations on their websites, their AdSense module, which is a module they've used for a long time for advertising. It's used on their search site. It's used on many other private company search sites. Actually, AOL uses their module as well. And essentially, this would allow Google to set up their advertising module on our website in our search function. Ads would generate based on keywords, and the advertiser's chosen audience. So as an advertiser, I pick which geographic areas I want to advertise to based on estimates, and I've had multiple conversations with the representatives there. On our web traffic and our search traffic, they would estimate between $5,000 and $10,000 in revenue annually based on this model. And then they also do have a family-friendly ad policy that is actually more stringent than our current internal advertising policy is. So that was some of the background there. And just to give you an idea of what we're talking about when we talk about this Google AdSense module, so this is the way that it looks on a site like AOL. If you punch in parks, you'll see on the left-hand side you've got advertising for whatever comes up with that keyword. Advertisers who chose that keyword chose the geography to advertise in that area. So if you were to see it on the city's website, essentially it could look something like this, where there'd be an ad bar on the side that would automatically populate with some of these advertisements. This one's a little tougher to see. It's a little fuzzy, but another incarnation of that is the advertising on the top of the search function with the search results below. Same idea, same concept. You can limit how many ads you want to pop up at one time. And then they also do offer the ability to have some graphical advertising as well if we were to decide that we wanted to move in that direction. Similar concept, again, advertisers purchase the geography and they pick their keywords or specific sites they want to advertise on, and then these automatically generate on your site. So that's essentially how that module would work. Now, again, there are some pros and there are some cons to this version of advertising. Some of the pros and the things that I alluded to and some of the concerns from residents and other groups is this would be a little less intrusive advertising. It wouldn't be a big banner ad on your homepage, although it does give you the option to expand that advertising if you chose to do so. From the calculations I did from my earlier presentation here, the ROI would be much higher than if sold in-house. If you recall, we were talking about probably $100 to $200 per ad based on our web traffic. Very minimal demands on staff time after that module is implemented. It really is, we do some front-end work with our website host, get that implemented, and then it's just a monitoring thing to make sure that their filters are working and we're not getting advertising that we don't want on our site. But otherwise, Google handles the sales and populating, and it's all automated. And then again, there's less grounds for those claims of endorsement or conflict of interest, since the city wouldn't be selling the advertising. It would be a third party that's actually selling the advertising. Of course, there are some negatives to that as well. While Google's policy and filters are more stringent than ours, we would still be relying on those filters to work. We would be relying on them to make sure they're not allowing advertising that shouldn't be passing through their filters to pop up on our page. If they do, we would have the ability to filter things even ad by ad. You can get down to a pretty minute level there. And this also, some of the residents who responded to the survey that wanted only Burnsville advertisers, obviously this wouldn't work for that either. So with that, I think there's two questions on the table right now, and of course I'll take any questions on this presentation as well. But the first is, does the council want to proceed with website advertising? And then the second would be, what kind of method do we want to use or further pursue as far as that website advertising. You see from the report that staff actually recommends that if we are to move forward with website advertising, that we go with a model like this.
Bill?
Would Google be like amenable to doing a one-year pilot project? I mean, are they
Oh,
willing
sure.
to-
I'm sure they would. We haven't gotten to a point because, again, this is all just exploratory, but, I'm sure we would be able to work out some sort of contract, if we wanted to only do it 12 months or try it for 6
Try
months.
it and see how it works. Mary?
Well, Bill was
Yeah.
expressed what I was thinking, and that is, I'm not wild with you about the concept for a lot of the very reasons that people expressed when they did express objections. The Google module does have some appeal. I mean, let's put it this way, it's the least bad.
Yeah. Yeah.
The problem is it's not going to generate a whole lot of money. So I'm thinking, do we really want to do this? However, I'm open to what Bill says. I mean, if we want to try it for a year and then say, rely on you to say,
It's working, it's
council,
not working.
you might want to look at this again.
Yeah. We've done this in the past where we'd say, okay, let's try it and see how
Yeah,
it
I'm
works.
open to
And
that. Not with any great enthusiasm, as you can probably tell.
yeah. Yeah. Okay, Suzanne?
What is the startup cost?
This would be, the only startup cost would be for us to work with our web host to get the module implemented. It would probably be some design charges on the Civic Plus side of things. That's our web host. And typically their design costs are under $1,000 if they need to work on the actual frame of the site. And depending on how it's laid out, we may even be able to work with it within the HTML of our page, which then there would be no design cost. Otherwise, with Google, as far as I know, there's no upfront cost.
Okay. Dan?
I would like to see us test it. I'm not, do you know, is there any term to sign up to? Can we do a 6-month trial, 1-year trial?
Again, I was approached by Google really as they want to pilot this, so I'm guessing they'll be very amenable to what kind of terms we want to work with. They were very helpful in helping me pull some of this information together. They actually provided those samples of what it would look like on our website. So, I think this would be something that they'd be very flexible with.
I just, it's a new area, and so I'm just
Yeah.
a
we're
little
being
cautious.
Yeah.
That's
We're all being cautious.
Well, I mean, as you all know, I've been very big on this. This is just a different channel and a different option that I hadn't really thought about, so I just wanted to make sure. I like that it's family friendly, they monitor it, minimal staff time after it's set up, and then it's done, it goes on its own revenue, so I think we should explore it
Explore.
cautiously, but I want to do it.
Bill?
And I agree. I would propose a year if we could cap it, because I just
And see
can't
how it
imagine
works.
6 months gets you.
Too short.
I propose
A year.
what you just said, but I think they should get a 1-year cycle just
Yeah.
to see
How it
how
works.
the
Agreed.
1-year cycle
My,
works.
here's my caution. I don't want to get locked in anything. I guess I want an out option, a termination option. If we put it out there and we get a flood of negative email that
Yeah.
our residents think it's just wrong on every front, it's not worth that revenue to continue to do it. So I want, when I say referring to a contract, I don't want to be bound by something. I want an exit option.
Well, and as you'll recall, Council, when I was here for our first presentation on that those were primarily
Yeah.
staff's concerns were
Yeah.
what is
Yep.
the perception
That's right.
going to be? And from our
Yeah.
survey results, again, very small sample, but it's about a 50-50
Yeah.
split. And then second was the ROI,
Mm-hmm.
depending on the amount of staff time that was needed to put into it, was it worth doing
Mm-hmm.
something like this? So.
I'd say try it.
Try it for a year and with an exit clause. And the criteria is that if there is a lot of objections from the resident, then we have the exit clause is activated.
I will work with my friends at Google on the next step.
Yeah.
We want it to work.
Yeah, we want it to work, but we
Absolutely.
also want to make sure that we're listening to our citizens and what their thoughts are, because they're the ones who are
Absolutely.
really looking at our website and wanting to understand what's going on in the city.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Madam Mayor, members of the council, with that, I'm assuming that you're also approving the changes to our advertising
Yes,
policy that were
the
attached,
policy.
just to make sure that that's consistent with.
Yeah,
Yeah.
because it is
I
consistent
apologize,
with
forgot to
the, yes.
Yep.
So all you have to do is just bring that back for adoption. All the changes.
Policies.
Or did you want us to
Madam Mayor, we can bring it to
to our
council
consent
for.
agenda?
Yep, that's
Just
fine.
so that we could,
Sure.
yeah.
If
But-
it's done and ready, we can move on it tonight. It's not a huge amount of change.
Yeah, are you comfortable with adopting with the red line?
Sure, it's pretty minimal.
I am.
don't think it's
Okay,
not a big
well then, who
housekeeping.
wants to make the motion to adopt the sponsorship and advertising policy?
Move to adopt.
Second.
Okay, Councilmember Sherry makes the motion, second by Councilmember Keeley. All in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, say nay, and the motion carries. So your policy is adopted, and work on an agreement and bring it before us on a consent agenda.
We will do that.
Okay, thank you very much. Okay, the next item on the agenda is also yours,
You don't
Mr.
get
Dahl, and this is
get
the
rid of
cable
that.
franchise needs assessment draft summary.
At least they're not laughing this time.
Is this another revenue generating thing?
Yeah. And you have with us this evening Sue Buskey from the Buskey Group, who has been working with you on the franchise agreement needs assessment.
Yes, Madam Mayor, members of the council, as you mentioned, I have joining me tonight Sue Buskey from the Buskey Group. She's one of the consultants that's working with the city on our cable franchise renewal process. Sue's firm was in charge of working on our needs assessment, which is what we're here today to do a summary report to tell you about the process that we use to gather that, some of the key findings, and things that go along with that report. The purpose of this is to really inform council of that process, what has all been done, some of the highlights that have been pulled from that information that has been gathered. And then staff will work with the Buskey Group after taking feedback or questions or things from the council after this meeting to develop that final report to bring back to you at a later date. I don't think I need to go into any background on the cable franchise at this point in time. I'll kind of just kick it over to Sue right now to go over her presentation, and then if there's any questions or clarification you need afterwards, we'll both be happy to answer any questions.
And also for our residents to also understand that this is just the report tonight. The public hearing is going to be on Tuesday.
Correct. Tuesday, August 20th.
Yes, next week. Okay.
That's the clicker.
Okay.
And welcome, Sue.
Well, thank you very much.
Yeah, welcome.
All right. See, I touched tech now.
This one.
All right. What I thought it would be helpful to do at this point is simply to quickly frame the process that local governments have to go through when a cable company wants a franchise renewed, only because it puts what I'm going to talk about next, which is a needs assessment and a proper framework. Essentially, when a cable company wants its contract renewed, it comes to a city 2.5 to 3 years prior to the expiration and says they want it renewed.
This is federal law.
This is federal law.
Yeah.
And then...
That's good for everybody to understand why we have to go through this process. It's because it's federal law.
Exactly. And then there's basically 4 components that occur. And sometimes you have to go through all 4, and sometimes you don't. The first is you're going to look at a performance review of the incumbent operator, which means you're going to look at what are the deliverables in the current contract and has the company done it. You're going to do a franchise fee audit and a PEG fee audit. In other words, right now under the current franchise, the cable operator is obligated to pay 5% of the gross TV revenues, not internet, not telephone, just TV. So you're going to want to do an audit to determine whether the proper amount was paid. The third piece under the past performance review you're going to want to do is you're going to want to look at what is the technical capability of the plant right now? Is it up to the state of the art? Is it run down? Does it meet National Electrical Safety Code criteria, et cetera? Because what this all does is give you a snapshot of where we're at now and where you've been under the current agreement, okay? Remembering that these agreements are typically 15 years long. So as rapidly as technology changes, when you're going through a franchise renewal process, you not only have to get a good perspective on where you're at now, but you have to get a perspective of where you want to be in 15 years. So that when you renew this franchise, you're not renewing it just to fix anything that needs to be fixed now, but you're thinking way ahead of the curve out 15 years, which is where the needs assessment piece comes in. Okay. Now, what this piece does is we don't ask people to say, what is your crystal ball? What do you think I'm going to need in 15 years? There's a number of different approaches to take that don't tie us to specificity, but tie us to overall goals, Okay. And so in a few minutes, I'll tell you a little bit about what we've done in the needs assessment. So that's the second component under renewal. Once you do those two things, then you go into, you take all of that data, and you take a look at, all right, these are the things that under law we can require based on the case that's been created, and these are the things we can't require but we want. And you go to the negotiating table and you sit down and you begin to go through a process to try to work things out. Try to find that middle ground where the parties can reach agreement. That's what's called the informal process. If you can't get to yes under the informal process, then you kick over into what's called the formal process. And then you issue a very lengthy request for proposal, or in the genre it's called a request for renewal proposal, because the entity that's responding is the entity that wants their contract renewed, which is the incumbent. Now, most of the time, you never get there. One of your neighbors has. The folks over in Roseville, the North Suburban Communications Commission, has just issued an RFRP because they couldn't get to yes with Comcast in the renewal process. And actually, I'm just working on that one. I also am working on one in Washington State with two cities about the same size as Burnsville. So that fourth piece, which we rarely get to, does sometimes happen. So those are the pieces. There's a lot more detail in them, but I just wanted to frame the federal process so you kind of understood where we're at. So it's very key in the front end, the performance review and the needs assessment, to do it thoroughly. Because if you don't do it thoroughly, you enter the negotiating process with no tools in your tool belt, because you've not built a legal case, past performance, future needs and interest, for where you want to go and what you want to have in the new franchise. So that's just a really quick overview of the federal process. Now, here's what's been done in the needs assessment process right here in Burnsville. We've done a series of things, and I'll click through them quickly, and then I'll go back and kind of give you a little bit more detail in each one. We've done focus groups. We've done an online survey with regard to subscribers. We've done an online survey with regard to institutional network users, which are your city and school folks. We've evaluated the 2012 residential survey that the city did. It had some questions about the cable company in it. And we've done a real thorough review of the current state of the art with regard to the equipment at Burnsville Community TV, over at the high school, here in the chambers, etc. Those are the various things we've done. Now let me go back through those with a little bit more detail and then tell you what we learned. We did a series of 6 community focus groups. There were 67 people in attendance from 58 different organizations, agencies, businesses in the community. We, during those focus groups, we did several things. We provided some kind of framework for what the city was doing and what the city can and cannot do. For example, a lot of people came with the idea that I'm not happy with my rates. I pay too much for my cable, and I don't want to pay. And city, you should fix this for me. Sorry, folks, can't fix that one. Local governments have almost no regulatory authority at all with regard to the rates. So we tried to frame in the front end of the focus groups what the city can do and what the opportunities are, and then a little bit about what they can't do. The next thing we did in the focus groups was we did brainstorming, and I'll talk to you about what we learned during the brainstorming process. The third piece we did was we gave people a survey, and we said, here, fill this out. And oh, by the way, if you don't want to fill it out here, the week we did the focus groups, we also opened an online survey, which was essentially the same instrument that we handed out during the focus groups. And we then held that online survey open for a month. We had almost 600 completed responses to the online survey, which I think is really good for a community this size. And people were really thorough. I mean, we tried to design the instrument so it's easy and quick to fill out, but also they did have an open-ended comment opportunity if they wanted to take advantage of it, and many of them did. So that was the residents' online survey, the focus groups, the institutional network. Is everybody familiar with what the INET is before? Otherwise, I'll not.
But I think you should say that because we have people listening, and so that they understand what you're talking about.
Excellent. Okay. Under the current franchise agreement, there's something called an institutional network. And the INET is essentially optical fiber that's been reserved for use by the schools, by elementary, junior high, high schools, by police, by fire, by the city departments and agencies to help them better and more efficiently do their job in providing public services. So under the current franchise, one of the things we wanted to find out was how the agencies, users that use that INET, are they satisfied with it? Are they satisfied with its speed, with its reliability, with its capability, and what they would like in the future? So the online survey we did for institutional network users, we had 34 different respondents from 16 different agencies, and they were split pretty evenly between 8 school agencies, departments and agencies, and 8 different city departments like police, fire, communications, etc. So that kind of gives you a sense. We learned a lot about the INET and what people thought was really good about it right now and what they'd like to see in the future as well. The next piece we did was we looked at that 2012 residential phone survey that the city does. Has a lot of questions about a lot of different things, but in fact there were several questions with regard to cable, and we looked at those and compared those to some of the data we gathered. And finally we went over to BCTV and we looked at we had to fill out information about the age of their equipment, how much they used it, the services that were provided, the kind of training, viewership on the channels, etc. And again, that was to give us a sense of how community television channels are being used here. With all of that, the draft report was prepared. So that kind of gives you kind of the various things we did as outreach to get input. Now let's give you a little bit of a sense of what we've learned. 2/3 of the people who responded to the online survey subscribed to Comcast. And of those, 55% subscribed to the tier of service that included HD. And one of the things I would note on this is, as I've looked at surveys I've been doing over the last 5 or 6 years, every year I ask some of these same questions in different places. The percentage that subscribe to HD keeps going higher and higher and higher. So your number is just right on point with what I've seen in other markets as well. Of the 2/3 that subscribe to cable, 42% also take internet and telephone. Okay, so now we have 42% of those who do subscribe to cable taking triple play, and of those 2/3, 41% subscribe to internet but not telephone, which means fully 83% of the subscribers subscribe to a service over and above just plain cable. This tells us a little bit about the direction in which cable companies have been going from a business perspective over the last 10 or 15 years because they're looking at the telecommunication services the public wants to have. Another thing we asked was, so how do you find out what you're viewing? Do you look at it do you look online? Do you look at the TV guide and paper? Do you see things in the newspaper? How do you use the interactive programming guide? We found out of all of the various options we gave people, we said, tell us the one you use the most. And the interactive programming guide was the one they used the most. In fact, they used that 3 times more than any of the other options. This is going to become really important in a few minutes because what I'm going to show you is something very important. Your community channels are not currently listed on the interactive programming guide.
That's correct.
Okay, so this is one of the things, you can about imagine what's going to be in one of the recommendations, okay, that we need to make sure that the community programming channels are listed on the interactive. Do you see how that you begin to connect the dots in all of this?
Because it only says government TV.
Yeah,
Exactly.
It doesn't
what
say
program.
what the programs are at what time. It just says government program.
Well, and the other thing that's interesting is in some cities, on their access channels, they carry program that's closed captioned. But so if a program is closed captioned, a viewer couldn't go to the guide and see that this local program was closed captioned, whether it was a NASA program, which NASA runs in some of the access channels, or Democracy Now! You can pick it. Those are things that come in that run on the access channels and are closed captioned, but your local public who has an impairment could not find out about it because it's not on the guide. A few other things we learned. We asked people a broad question: how are you? Are you happy with your service from Comcast? And as you can see, fully 44% of the subscribers indicated that they were either somewhat or very dissatisfied with their services from Comcast. Now, I'll be fair, 41% said they were very satisfied or satisfied. So it kind of split right down the middle. This number is a little higher on the dissatisfied than I've seen in some places, and but that's what we learned from the subscribers.
Okay, Mary?
is there any connection to the cost of the services with this response?
We asked people who didn't subscribe why they didn't subscribe, and cost was the primary factor. But as you could see, a relatively small percentage of the people who responded to the survey didn't subscribe. Okay.
But let me put it differently, and that is that you, when you started your presentation, you said you've got a lot of complaints about the high cost. So what I'm saying is was this of the current subscribers, was this their way of saying it costs too much?
Well, it could be, and if you give me a second, I'm going to get to a question.
You get to that.
I'm going to get
Okay.
to something that answers that question.
All right.
Okay. We also asked them a whole list of things, picture and sound quality, reliability of the signal, and all kinds of customer service things. And the majority of the subscribers did say that picture and sound quality and the reliability were good or very good. However, this goes to your question, the question you just posed. When we asked them to rank very satisfied, et cetera, the things that fell sort of at the bottom of the barrel were, number one, rates charged, okay? Also, the ability to quickly get to a customer service representative, and then also the ease of getting problems repaired or solved. In other words, we spot customer service issues spotted up at the top of why people tended to be most dissatisfied with the company. And in fact, we had almost 280 written in comments, and 86% of them were negative. And the bulk of them had to do with the kinds of things you're seeing up there. So the customer service arena is an area where local governments do have authority, and where we might want to delve into a little bit deeper, because we can, in fact, require customer service standards that are over and above the federal minimums, but they need to be driven by the specific findings of surveys like this. Let me go on to the next couple of slides. Here we started to find out a little bit more about how folks view your community television channels, your public education and government access channels, 14, 15, 16, 18, 19, and 20. We found 60% of all the survey respondents, in fact, had watched the channels. We asked them how did they find out about it, and they said channel surfing. And this goes to the point I just made about connecting the dots about the importance of having the listing of the program and the description, just like the other channels, on the interactive programming guide. Also, we found that
Pardon me, is that 60% of the 592 that responded in the survey?
of all survey respondents, yeah.
So about 300, we have about 350 viewers.
Of those who responded to the survey, yes. I think they're probably
Yeah.
So we apply that 60%, we have 26,000 households. 60% is about 15,000 viewers, actually.
Well, and
we
actually,
only have 14,000 subscribers,
Yeah.
cable subscribers. So.
Yeah.
Okay, so 7,000 or 8,000.
well, and
That's a big number.
actually, one of the things I wanted to point out is in the report, in the 2012 residential survey, telephone survey, the question was asked about viewing, and I've just pulled up my footnote here. 74% of respondents said they had watched city council or other meetings during the past year. So the number, that's why you pull in that data into this overall report, and it builds the case and raises the bar even higher as far as the value of people. And the value of people are placing on this in a moment is going to come up with another question. We did learn that folks felt the picture and sound quality on the community channels was not as good as the other channels. And we made it real clear in the question, we're not talking about production values here. We're talking about the picture and sound quality. This is something, actually, when we did our physical inspection over at the facility, we spotted something that I'm hoping that when we hear from the engineering firm that's doing the engineering review, we begin to get our hands around, because there's some kind of a transmission issue. We haven't quite figured it out yet, but it began to reveal itself both through this survey and hopefully it's one of those things that might even be able to be fixed before we ever get to the renewal negotiating table. Kind of moving along, we asked people how much they valued the access channels, and we found that 75% of them felt that it was either very important or important to have these kinds of channels available on the cable system that provided truly local programming about Burnsville community, and that they felt it was a valuable public service and held another really very important services to not only the city but also to community organizations within the community as well. Now, you may recall I mentioned the focus groups we did and the brainstorming. I'm not going to get real, I'm kind of doing a 30,000-foot overview here tonight for you, but we asked 4 questions. And the first question we asked was, what are the key issues facing Burnsville in the next 5 years? And we didn't say, what are the key cable TV issues? Why? Because under federal law, we're to identify future community-related needs and interests, okay? So I always start my brainstorming with big picture. What are the big issues? We got a lot of things. I've listed the categories. We sort of look at all these, analyze them. They kind of shake down into different groupings. And on this slide, you'll see some of the groupings. For instance, economic development, jobs, poverty, education-related issues, technology and telecom issues, networking and collaboration, the changing demographics of this community. These are some of the things that came out when folks were telling us, well, okay, what are the big issues that in the next 5 years we're going to have to be dealing with in the community? The next question we dealt with, and I kind of tie them together, is what makes it hard for us, the city agencies or a resident or for a community group or for the schools to help address, to communicate what they need to communicate out to Burnsville residents, okay? And we here we're beginning to narrow it down to communications issues, not cable TV necessarily, but communications issues. And again, we categorize it. I'm just giving you the categories of input we got and where they fell. But again, information overload. There's so much coming at us. How do I figure out? How do I find the Burnsville information that I really want? Language problems. We have English as a second language for people in this community. And how do we deal with that and communicate our information as community groups or city agencies to people for whom English is a second language? Communications barriers. I don't know how to use social media to effectively work with to help get my message out to my community groups. Or I really like to do a program about what my organization is about, but I don't have the production skills. So these are some of the things that started to come out through that brainstorming process, all of which feed into the overall community needs and interests. We did another question which said, tell us if there were no barriers, what you'd like to do from a standpoint of programming, or how you'd like to use cable, or what the technology sorts of things, and we got hundreds of ideas. Then we led to what would make it easier to do those things if there were no barriers. And interesting, the top category there was Comcast infrastructure. And what we got there were things like, that tied back to the customer service area. Tech people who can answer my questions when I call Comcast, it may be a basic question, or another one that came out is, I know a lot about this stuff, but I want somebody who's more advanced can answer my question at Comcast. Or more friendly IVRs, in other words, automatic answering services. So when I call, I don't go into voicemail hell, never to crawl out again for the next 2 hours, okay? And it's a bit of an exaggeration, but no, you should have read some of the comments. Anyway. Point being that one of the things that would make it easier to use cable is, I think, just more customer service, customer-friendly environments. And, of course, then a lot of things came in about using the access channels, having equipment, having enough funding for staffing, making sure the channels are high definition, that the programming is on the interactive programming guide. All of these sorts of things are all things that came out. Now, I'm going to briefly go through this next category and then get to the key recommendations. On the INET survey, we found that 75% of the survey respondents, remember we had 34 different respondents from 16 different agencies, both schools and local government, and we found email, internet, reliability, public Wi-Fi, automatic software updates. These are all some of the things that the folks who are agency folks who are using the INET to deliver public services felt were very important or important. The INET itself and its reliability and its speed was ranked very high. Okay. Almost 2/3 of the people who are INET respondents said they use the INET and they use connectivity to communicate regionally, not just locally, and on a multiple times a day basis in many cases. The most significant information technology or IT challenges were things like, again, making sure that there was network reliability, there was security, controlling costs, okay, network speed, and wireless connectivity. Again, these are just some of the things we learned from the INET survey. And then we asked people about, when we think about IT, information technologies, a lot of times we think about data, not TV. So we did ask them questions about TV. And we asked them if they use the actual cable channels on TV sets in their workplace. And the answer from many of them was yes. And then we said, well, what do you use it for? And they said the paid channels. They said broadcast channels and national news and weather. Okay, those are the heaviest uses in facility. So now we'll take a look at a final few things with regard to BCTV, because I haven't talked a lot about that yet tonight. I've been connecting a few dots, but we did a real thorough facility inspection, and in fact, I had one of my consulting engineers come in who also looked at the City Council chamber equipment, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment. Most of the equipment that's in place right now at BCTV is fairly new. It was acquired in 2009, with the exception of the equipment in this room and the production truck. And one of the things you'll hear in a few minutes is those are the two things that need the most immediate attention, okay? Some things that need to really be addressed fairly quickly. We found that in addition to that, with regard to the equipment, if we want to be able to deliver city council meetings or local sporting events and things, the kind of things you see on the access channels, in high definition, we need to upgrade the portions of the equipment that need to be upgraded. So most of the cameras are already HD over in the facility at the high school. But there are other things that are part of the package that have to be upgraded so that they are HD and they can deliver an HD signal. And of course also, Comcast has to agree to deliver the access channels in HD, okay, which right now they're not obligated to do under the current franchise agreement. So these are just, a few of the things we've learned with regard to that. So the recommendations, and now we're down to the end. I'm sorry, this is taking a while. But 3 categories of recommendations: cable plant and head end, customer service, and PEG access facilities and equipment. So I'm going to go through those 3, the bullets under those 3 categories. First, in the new franchise, you need to make sure you have language that makes sure the cable plant stays at state of the art and is capable through the term of that 15-year franchise or however long it ends up being when you negotiate it, that at the end of that franchise, the cable operator is able to deliver what is then considered state-of-the-art services. Number 2, your community access channels from the cable head end and equipment and facilities perspective, you need to, number 1, make sure that the access channels can be delivered in high definition, okay, which means the cable company has to make certain changes in the equipment at their head end in order for it to pass through an HD signal. Ironically, most of the cameras, even little camera you buy and you record your kids with now, is a high definition camera. You can't even buy something that's not a high definition camera anymore. Okay, so we need to make sure that the cable plant and the head end can pass through the access channels as high definition, and that there's also the ability to pass through closed captioning that might be in the signal, and what we call SAP, or secondary audio program, which is for individuals who are, in fact, hearing impaired. Okay, it's called video description. And also that there's video on demand. So some of the kinds of content that you would run on your government access channel is evergreen. It's the kind of thing that maybe Halloween costume safety for kids. Well, the fire department may make a piece that could be used over and over again for many years, but you'd run it on the channel during the season coming up to Halloween, but having it available on the video on demand, folks could call it up anytime. Okay, so that's what the VOD does for your community channels. Making sure, one of the things we learn from people is they really like live programming from the community, events and activities and performances and so forth. So making sure that the INET is capable of being able to originate live content for the community channel from locations in addition to the ones that are currently on the INET. And to make sure, that last bullet, that the complete descriptions of the community programming, the public education and government access is on the interactive programming guide, which is not just something that the staff at Burnsville Community TV would doing, but also something that Comcast has to make arrangements for. And in fact, Comcast is doing this in quite a number of other places already around the country, so it's not a big ask. It's something that we're seeing in renewed franchises quite often now. Customer service, we need to have customer service standards that meet and I would say in this case probably exceed the federal minimums. You have to remember the federal minimum customer service standards were established about at least 15 years ago, I think more like 20. So even the description of telephone answering and 30-second waits is really kind of like 20-year-old descriptions of what the way, in contrast to the way things are done with IVRs today. So we need to update those customer service standards and bring them up but also it's really important once you have them, having the best customer service standards in the world don't do anybody any good if you don't enforce them. So you need to be willing to enforce them, and you need to make sure you have tools in your enforcement tool belt. And that's part of the language that would be contained not necessarily in the customer service standards, but in your penalties section of your franchise agreement. Kind of moving along, making sure that, right now there are 6 channels, 14, 15, 16, 18, 19, 20 for access, that I think you should keep that number of channels, and that there should be language in the franchise based on the public input we heard, that if there is a need for additional ones, there's some kind of reasonable trigger mechanisms built into the document that will allow that to occur, okay? Another thing that we heard a bit about was the universal service tier, of which there aren't a lot of people who subscribed in the past too, but people did think that was an important thing.
Could you explain that
Yeah.
to me?
Okay.
What is universal
service
service tier?
Under the current franchise agreement, there is language that basically says that the cable operator must make the lowest cost tier of service available free of charge to anybody who requests it. That's what's called the and typically that would include your access channels.
In Burnsville's case, it is only the access channels. So anyone who wants to request
Yeah.
the access
So
channel-
anybody who,
If you have
I'm not
DirecTV, if you have DirecTV, you can request it.
and I don't have anything except broadcast, so
you could
I could request this,
Yeah.
and they would have to.
Yeah.
Now, does the property owner pay for the installation?
I believe that you are given one, but now they're requiring digital boxes, so you're given one digital box that's programmed just for the PEG channels, and they will do it, install on one television set in your property.
Okay.
So, and what's interesting on this one is, and this is actually, it's interesting because this is a very unusual obligation under your current franchise. And I've really only seen it in this area of the country, and just around Minneapolis, St. Paul, Burnsville, Eagan, Roseville. That's the only place I've seen it. I used to see it when I've done this a long time. Many years ago, I used to see universal tiers a lot more, but in franchises that were renewed at the time this one was renewed the last time, I see it very rarely.
Yeah. Dan, you had a question?
Is there another tier up, I think it's called Lifeline or something like that, where there's 25 or 30 channels available at about $12 to $15 or something like that?
That's correct.
But only upon request.
Yeah, I mean, and that's one of the things that as I've started to dig into some of since we did this report, Marty and I have been talking about the need to dig into some of the complaints that have come in to the city over the years. And one of the things we've seen, and I was just going through them again today, people aren't told what their options are, and it's not advertised very well. And this is a customer service standard issue, okay? This is something that is not in your current customer service standards, and you could put in there. Okay. Another thing on the customer service thing, since we're kind of I want to follow up a little bit, is the problem that occurs sometimes when you talk to the cable company, I'm going to subscribe, there's a deal going on, I'm going to get it for X amount of dollars a month, and then when you get your first bill, it's not what they told you on the phone. Okay. One of the things that Marty and I were just talking about was the concept of, well, why can't they just send an email after you have the phone conversation, going, confirming that, blah, 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 okay?
Yeah.
Or a postcard. these are sorts of things, and we think about customer service standards, we can think about, okay? They're not in the ones right now, but they are the sorts of things we're hearing. Let me kind of continue on here and to talk a little bit more the final recommendations with regard to your access channels, your public education and government channels. Number one, we've talked about maintaining the current number of channels. And in today's world, the channel number thing, because of the digital, the system being all digital, we don't even call it channel number as much as we call it channel location anymore. And the idea is to keep those local community channels located close to the local broadcast channels. Okay? So you'll notice there that I talked about channel locations in this language. Another thing that we've relearned was that it's going to be important to make sure that the community channels and the access channels have the same level of functionality and capacity as the highest quality commercial channel in the system. Okay? It doesn't cause the cable operator to have to incur any additional dollars to make that available. But it does cause them to have to use a little bit more of their bandwidth than otherwise they might want to use for the community channels, which is one of the arguments I hear when I sit across the table from the cable companies when we're negotiating. Making sure that there's storage and the capability to have video on demand. Again, this is something that Comcast has been offering recently in other markets and renewal, and certainly came out as part of your needs assessment process. I think I've covered this pretty well. This piece has to do with the funding that's available. Currently under your franchise, there's a certain amount of funding available over and above the 5% franchise fees to fund equipment and facilities and so on and so forth to support access. What we saw based on the needs assessment is there is clearly a need to continue to have such funding available and to allow that funding to grow as the needs and the use in the community grow. Okay. Initially, we want to make sure that that equipment, council chambers and the production truck, as far as equipment is concerned, those are the things that most need initial attention. But there are, if you want to go HD, that changeover, again, that's not going to require all equipment to be changed, just certain pieces to be changed, needs to be looked at as quickly as reasonably possible as well. So that gives you some sort of sense of timing for the equipment piece of this. And then finally, this last slide, we're just talking about to make sure that the access channels are on the lowest on the interactive programming guide. And in many cases, in some franchises, we've actually seen that there's a certain amount of what we call ad availabilities, or that's the 30 and 60-second spots that run on ESPN, or that the cable operator has cable operators have an inventory of spot advertising that they have the ability to sell or to give to nonprofits or whatever. That there be some of those ad avails available to Burnsville Community TV to promote the city council meetings, or maybe it's to promote a sporting events or a big community festival, etc. So that's something you can negotiate for as part of the promotional pieces to promote community uses of the cable system. So in summary, that's a 30,000-foot overview of the draft we've gotten to so far on the needs assessment report.
Okay, thank you. Questions for Sue or Marty?
I have a question that really doesn't relate to the draft, and that is, I was hearing what you were talking about, the HD and how everything, even simple cameras now are HD. Why does Comcast have an additional charge to deliver what's being filmed or photographed in HD, to deliver it? Why do they charge extra to deliver it in HD to the terminal?
Well, how cable companies charge is partially directly connected to how much they pay the programming supplier. They pay ESPN for those 5 channels that are in HD, okay? And so the amount of bandwidth that...
So it's related to bandwidth?
It's related to bandwidth, but more than anything, it's related to the cost that the cable operator is paying to get the content in the first place, okay? Now, to give you an example, you'll see that most cable companies have not just one ESPN, but probably 5, okay? They can't buy one ESPN. ESPN won't sell them one ESPN. You have to buy all 5. Okay, and if any of you have been watching the mainstream news in the last while, you've probably noticed that there's a lot of debates going on around the cost of, in particular, sports programming that the providers, the cable companies, have to pay to the ESPNs in order to deliver it, and the current terms and conditions of their contracts. Well, it's interesting because a similar thing's going on with the broadcasters now too. Broadcasters have something called must-carry or retransmission consent. It used to be that the broadcasters would say, cable company, you don't have to pay me to carry my broadcast channel because I just want to make sure you carry it. Okay, but now broadcasters are saying they're opting for and this is a FCC thing, it's a federal law thing again. They're opting for retransmission consent, which means the cable operator pays the broadcaster to be able to carry their program. And so there's a real interesting conundrum going on around costing right now that's related to the relationship between the providers, whether it's DirecTV or a cable operator, and the content, the people who deliver you the content and the people they get the content from.
CBS is a big,
Yeah,
with
there's-
Time Warner.
With Time Warner, right.
Right.
Comcast hasn't been named too often, but DirecTV, was it Pac-10, just said they're going to go on a national advertising campaign to encourage people to give up DirecTV because they won't sign a deal to carry Pac-10
Yeah.
football games in there. It is a pissing match, pardon the expression,
that.
in a big way around the entire industry, and it's been interesting to read and follow, and I'm just kind of glad I have Comcast right now because most of the Dish is in a big tiff with a lot of them, with CBS and a bunch, and so is DirecTV now. And so far, Comcast, and Time Warner is in too, Comcast isn't mentioned that much. They've seemed to have been able to negotiate, content deals with these providers and escape some of that war that's going on.
Part of the reason why is because they're so big. And there's other reasons, but that's clearly one of them.
I have a question, Marty. And because we're at the 30,000-foot level and we're looking 15 years out, the Performing Arts Center, do we need equipment there as we look to the future? Because at one point we had an education system there, and so that they can broadcast out to the other facilities within the district. Are there opportunities for that? And I also know that when we have corporations doing their meetings there, that sometimes they want to film or they want to broadcast out to their facilities in other parts of the country.
Yes, Madam Mayor. Right now, we do have the capability to go live on our PEG channels from the Performing Arts Center. Again, you need the truck is what we use to be able to facilitate that live feed. So we are able to go live to our PEG channels from that facility, along with a number of others in the city. We have talked about internally about the potential of actually permanently wiring the theater, or even expanding into other rooms if needed. But the main conversation has been about the theater, permanently wiring the theater so that it would be more of a plug-and-play type experience. Even being able to build in cameras eventually. Again, there's costs associated with that, but yeah, it's definitely been something that we've discussed internally.
Because I do know that we do have companies here in town who have facilities in other parts of the country. And when they have a corporate meeting, one of the things that might be useful to them is being able to broadcast that meeting to other facilities in other parts of the country. So I don't know if that's something that can be done in the agreement to equip the Performing Arts Center with
It's definitely something we can discuss when we go back
Certainly.
and look at the report.
and especially for the things that we're doing here right now with regard to our school district, and because it is a multifaceted facility, and so the school district needs to have some kind of education program, and they want to broadcast it to other schools, that's available?
Yep.
Yeah. Dan?
Where does the source of all this funding come from?
Well, the funding basically one step back, then two steps forward, okay? Under federal law, local governments have the ability to only require a limited number of things. And one of the things they have the ability to require is support for public education and government access channels, as well as the channels, as well as INETs, et cetera.
But who's paying the bill?
So Comcast is paying the bill. But then the question goes, who's paying Comcast?
Who's paying the bill?
And the subscribers are paying Comcast.
Exactly. So everything that we do in this contract comes from the subscriber base, not from Comcast, because they're passing along that in a PEG fee that's on everyone's bill.
They're actually not obligated under law. It's optional.
To pass it on to the
Pass-
subscribers.
yes. It is a choice they make. We can't require them not
It's
to.
on my bill.
But they can pass it on.
Gotcha.
And I do have to add this footnote. And some of the discussions that I've had over the years with cable operators, we've gotten, and Comcast is one of them, and there are others, they've agreed not to pass certain parts of it on. And it has a lot to do with what goes on at the negotiating table, if there are past performance issues, if there are issues that would require this as part of a settlement and release. These are all things that start to come into play when you go to the table. So you're right. At the end of the day, the company can put anything they want into the subscriber bill because the rates are not regulated. However, one final footnote on that. I know of a number of places where cities have said, we would rather have our subscribers pay less, so we're not going to require them to provide access funding. And guess what? The rates didn't go down. In fact, if there was money in the bill, if they were currently getting funding and the funding went away to the community, the bill stayed the same. So it's just, it's frustrating, but that's the reality.
And this same PEG fee is not levied against any other provider, DirecTV?
If it's
Internet
if they are a wireline provider, yes. If they are not a wireline provider, in other words, if they use the airways, no. Okay. If they put a wire on the streets, yes.
Okay, thank you.
So very quickly, if AT&T or Verizon or CenturyTel decided to deliver video services, they would have to come, they would have to get a franchise, and they would then be paying the same level of support. And the number of subscribers that are people who choose to subscribe to cable would then be divided, so to speak, between one company or the other. And that's something that in a lot of markets I've dealt with in recent years, we would have two companies. We'd have usually a Verizon or an AT&T and the incumbent. But both companies then would be providing. But they're both wireline providers, and that's the key.
Has there ever been any bills in Congress to levy any kind of PEG fees to the satellite providers or internet providers that don't pay that now, that deliver content?
There were discussions at the FCC with regard to interpretation of the rules, but this goes back quite a number of years ago. The whole arena of federal law as it relates to telephone, internet, and cable, they're like these silos. But it's all today delivered on the same wire. And it used to be siloed, but the law's never been changed. And DirecTV. So there's a huge rewrite of the communications law that needs to occur, but it's not going to occur for a while.
One last follow-up. Is there any threat to our PEG fee revenues in future years that you see is there any bills that have been introduced that might change what the current laws are?
State law, state franchising would be, I haven't seen anything to speak of at the, not to say there wouldn't be something at the federal level, but at the state level, that's where we've seen the biggest threats and the biggest losses in the last, since 2005, 20 states have changed their laws to remove the authority of local governments to grant franchises. And in so doing, in some of those states, there is no funding for community programming anymore.
Councilmember Keeley, just to piggyback on your previous question, I think that's a common misconception of a lot of people that Comcast has an exclusive franchise with the city, and why doesn't the city kick out Comcast and get somebody new? When the reality is that any company at any time could come and ask for a franchise. There's no limit to the number of franchises we have in Burnsville. The caveat to that is that federal law, again, back to the federal side of thing, requires that a new provider needs to build out their system to the extent of the incumbent provider before they can start operating or offering service. So they can't go neighborhood by neighborhood by neighborhood and build up that subscriber base, which is why you don't see it happen very often.
Boy, that's an incumbent advantage like no other. Yes. Build out the entire network before you can start delivering.
Any other questions?
No, but I just want to say I learned a lot. Thank you.
Yeah.
Very,
Well
very
done,
educational.
Sue. Very well done. And Marty, thank you for your report. I believe that we all learned a great deal, and our residents also learned a great deal. So thank you.
Thank you very much.
And Madam Mayor, as I mentioned, we'll be going back, we'll be working with Sue on some of these things ongoing, and when
Yeah.
we do have a final report ready, we'll bring that back to council for your acceptance, along with some staff comments and
The
background.
recommendations for the negotiation. Yes.
Just to follow up,
Yes.
we do have the public hearing scheduled for next Tuesday, so we do not need the final report before the public
No.
hearing.
And
No.
if I might,
Because of
about the
just the
final
public-
report,
Yes.
it is a matter of, remember I talked about the negotiations, and then if you didn't get the yes, you have to do the RFRP? You don't want to finalize the
Yeah.
report
Before
until
you
you
get-
go, you know, that you got the deal
Yeah.
done informally, or
Yeah.
or you've issued you're going to issue an RFRP, because you have to close the record
Yes.
at the point you finalize the report. So it's just a very important thing and needs to be said there.
Right,
so.
and at the public hearing is also information that goes into the report that is data for the negotiating table as well.
Very good.
Yeah, so, okay, thank you very much. Nicely done. Okay. We're moving on, and now we're getting to the items on the round table. Now, did anybody want to take a break before we continue? Because there's a lot of items in the round table. Okay, we'll take a break.
Quick five?
5. Yes,
I have an opinion.
okay.
My opinion is I don't think it's necessary. I think we had a great presentation. I've not heard a compelling argument for what need that is. We seem to have a very experienced person who just told us what the trends are, what the circumstances, what the recommendations for
Yeah.
changes, and that included customer service, which would be a citizen thing. So I just,
Well, and the way I also see it is that Mr. Dahl doesn't need us to tell him that he can convene a group. If he wants to, he can certainly convene a group and be before us at the public hearing to speak to whatever issues they also gather.
Well, in just to add to
Doesn't
what
need a
you
permission
said,
from us.
just add to what you said, and that is that we did just heard that the people who do speak at the public hearing will have their comments folded into this evaluation. So I guess I don't see anything that's missing
Yeah.
that a citizens group would provide at this point. I thought maybe Mr. Dahl would be here tonight to say something along that line, but I guess I'm comfortable with the way things are going.
Well, yeah, and I think the thing that we can say to Mr. Dahl, if he really wants to convene a group of people.
Sure.
He can certainly do that. Anybody can do that. He doesn't need our permission to convene a citizens group. He can convene a citizens group, and then they can speak at the public hearing.
Right.
He doesn't need our sanction. Yes?
Well, I was the one that supported Mr. Dahl's request because I wanted to learn more about what he was wishing for and wanting to do, and this would have been the perfect forum to do it. And
I know.
unfortunately, he's not here, and I didn't hear from him, so I didn't know he wouldn't be here. So
Yeah.
we're kind of left empty-handed at this point.
Yeah,
To
but
be able to do anything.
he wanted to get a resident committee together. He can do that. He doesn't need our permission to do that.
It's not here.
You agree?
You know, government's run by those who show up, and he did show up tonight.
Well,
And
he showed up, and I
we
think
did once, and then we,
Yeah.
But,
you know,
but we can just let him know if he wants to convene a group, he could certainly do that.
and
He doesn't need our
yes,
permission.
I know.
Right.
He fully well knows, as a former senator, that government is run by people who show up, and he
Yeah.
knows. And something must have came up, and he wasn't able to
Yeah.
be here. But,
But you haven't heard from him?
no, I have not. That's why
I
I'm
haven't
kind of in the
heard
dark.
from him, except for prior to the council meeting and when he spoke, but, the way I also said to him, he said, he doesn't need our permission to convene a group.
No.
I think it sounded to me like the essence of what he was asking for was to reconstitute our citizen-involved cable commission,
Oh, yeah, that's.
something like that,
yeah.
and get involved, and, you know, bring it back in light of this 15-year renewal coming up.
Yeah, I
And
don't
it
think
made
that-
sense on the surface, but, you know, I agree we have outstanding work done that we just witnessed, and it's very thorough, and it's going to position us, I think, in a great spot to handle these negotiations, and I would just want to hear his input as to what else he wants to. But again, he's not here, so we can't really do anything with it.
Okay. All righty, so then we'll move on, and the
Wait,
next.
you have a,
Oh, yes, Bill,
Going to
I'm
make a
sorry.
comment. See, I was a little worried that he wanted a seat at the table on negotiation. That
Yeah.
was my
Yeah.
interpretation
And I don't
of what he said, that, you know, that he thought a citizen should have a seat at the table.
Right.
And that was what I was concerned about, that I just couldn't see authorizing that.
Yeah.
That's all.
Yeah, I think we need to make sure that we have professionals at the table to negotiate what we need for our community moving forward.
Right here.
Okay? All right, so Councilmember Sherry.
Yes.
Legislative position on residential speed limits.
I asked to have this on roundtable because I've had some discussion with our Public Works Director, Steve Albrecht, about this. We frequently get complaints from citizens in our neighborhoods that people are exceeding the speed limits.
And it's their neighbors.
It's their neighbors. So what do? We get Gizmo. We put Gizmo up.
Yeah.
And they say, gee, they're only going 30 miles an hour, but it's too fast for our street. And in general, because I visit other parts of the country, some big bad cities that I will not name right now, who in their residential streets, they have a speed limit of 25 miles an hour. Now, on their collectors, it's 30, but in the neighborhoods, it's 25. And so, in discussion with Steve, and with Heather, too, I was thinking that, and Steve recommended, too, that if we were to do this, the best way to go through this would be to put it on our legislative agenda, if you would all agree, so that then we could engage the league and perhaps others to look at this as a statewide thing, not just for the city of Burnsville.
Okay. Bill?
Yes?
You're coming up to the microphone this time.
Yeah, but because
Yeah.
people can't
No,
hear
sit
it.
back.
Come up to the microphone.
I'm sorry, I can't support Mary in this.
Why?
I think
Well, let me
30,000.
speed down your street at 30 miles an hour. I bet you wouldn't like it one bit if you had little
The speed
kids.
limit is a speed limit. You're supposed to drive to the conditions. Correct, that is the maximum. And there can be circumstances in a speed limit of 30 that's not a proper speed. I mean, if there are pedestrians or whatever. So the duty is on the driver.
Yeah.
And the law, just because it's 30 miles an hour, that is not a automatic pass for driving in that way. I mean,
I understand what you're saying from a legal perspective, but I think from a reality perspective, we are basically a street without sidewalks. So children let's take Walden, for example. Walden has Welcome Lane, which is pretty long street. It winds, has hills, it has curves, and has a lot of kids, and it goes way down, all the way down between 130th and Thoreau. And that is a neighborhood, and if we want children in our community, I think that one of the safety issues where we don't have sidewalks for people who might be considering housing in these areas, and let's use Walden as an example, and that is, can my kids safely ride a bike out into the street? I don't think they can. And I think the only reason for that is that I think that a speed limit of 30 is just too high. Now, I agree with you in terms of conditions, but who's to monitor that? The mother who's screaming at the driver coming down, at 30 miles an hour? I don't know.
Suzanne?
Well, I mean, I agree with the safety issue, but of course in my mind I say, well, how much is that going to cost?
It doesn't
change
cost
all the
anything.
Speed limit signs to 25 miles an hour.
We don't have many residential speed limit signs because it's statutory. We don't put a lot of those in. Then it's law that it's 30 miles an hour. We post it in areas where, for the most part, it needs to be posted because it was established through a speed study or something. And in neighborhoods where they've requested a 30-mile-an-hour sign, that's the locations that we do have a 30-mile-an-hour sign. Metro Cities does have a policy that they've pushed for years on residential speed limits. So Metro Cities does actually have the 30 to 25 proposal that's been on the table, and I don't know for how long, but that is one of their policies.
It has been for a long time, and there's always a lot of pushback on all of that. And I remember some years back when it went through, but Mary.
But I think it's a common sense thing.
Yeah.
It's a common sense thing. I mean, I think we talk so much in this community about making it pedestrian friendly. Well, if our neighborhoods are not pedestrian friendly, how can we then think that our larger, more common areas like the heart of the city should be pedestrian friendly? I think the time has come to really maybe get behind Metro Cities on this one, and let's try to make this more pedestrian, little kids on tricycle friendly city.
You don't want them riding their trikes on the road.
All right, let's have maybe that's an extreme example, but children who are old enough to bike on the road,
Yeah.
they can't.
Yeah. Okay. Suzanne and
Well,
then Dan.
I know, and I mean, I support it. I think a lower speed limit would be great, and I'm kind of the pessimist that says, well, the ones who are speeding.
We'll continue to speed.
Yes.
But then we can do something.
Well,
about
if
it.
you have someone there to get them. But in our neighborhood,
But-
I always drive 20 miles an hour down my road because I know there are a lot of kids out there, including my daughter.
A lot of people don't.
But there are a lot of people that don't.
That's right.
And, I mean, we have good patrolling in through our neighborhood, but,
And if I may use the Welcome Lane example again, they put Gizmo out there. And then people were shocked that the ones that they thought were speeding, who were not really caring too much that there might be children on these streets, they were perfectly within the law.
Dan, you had a thought?
I just think you hit on the real crux of the problem, Councilmember Sherry, is we unfortunately, I think very unfortunately, do not have sidewalks where we
Were
should.
built in the 70s, 60s, and 70s when people didn't want sidewalks.
Yeah, and it's really unfortunate because we're not a pedestrian-friendly city from that standpoint, because the sole
Right.
reason that sidewalks exist are to get people off the road,
Right.
and we don't have
Right.
a lot of them, just as part of our city, which is.
But one thing we
And then
can't,
one of the things that we have tried to do, that every time we reconstruct roads, there is a provision in all of that to ask the neighbors if they want to put sidewalks in, but then it's part of getting to that pedestrian friendly. And we put that policy in place, and they always all opt out of it. Right, Steve?
Does it cost?
Yeah. Yeah.
But
They always all
if we
opt out,
can't put
but
in
It's
sidewalks,
been there for over 10
we
years.
could, with other join with other communities who have this same interest in saying, let's just lower the speed limit by 5 miles an
Sure.
hour.
Who's got that bill by, or, I mean,
Well,
what
all
committee?
Mary is
It's ours,
asking,
actually.
It's in the transportation, yeah, I just, for some reason,
Yeah. all Mary
maybe I don't
is
remember seeing it in
asking
that
here
legislative
is for us to put it on our legislative agenda.
Right.
And then that allows us to talk with MLC, and then we can support the metro cities. And then we don't know what'll happen with LMC.
I think that would be your next step is
Is
to
to
talk to
find out.
LMC and find out. I don't know the history of whether LMC's gone down that path or not. I looked through LMC's policies and
And
didn't
it's
see any
never
reference
been-
to
yeah.
that on there. So
And the thing is, because LMC,
they represent
reaches
all the cities.
all the
It's not
cities
as big
around.
an issue in the small cities as it is in the metro area.
Yeah.
Right.
So.
the small cities really don't care.
I think that if we want to make this community appeal to families with young children, that and then not just singling out our community because this would be statewide.
Well, the
But I
thing
think
is, that's the
that-
only
Yeah.
avenue we can go, because remember, it's
Right,
statutory.
exactly. I get that. Because Steve made sure I got it.
Now and then, certain streets driving by, there's the yellow sign that says, slow when children present.
Yeah.
It's around schools too, but sometimes you see them in neighborhoods, do neighborhoods request those to be installed or pay for
And
them
then,
to
and
be
then
put?
they become like wallpaper, they don't see it.
Yeah.
Tried to get away from them because they
They
do
don't-
become numb to them,
Yeah.
and they become ineffective, and then
Yeah.
it just causes. Then it's a kind of it's an extra sign that we have to take care of that doesn't mean anything.
Yeah.
It's not really enforceable from any legal
Yeah.
standpoint.
Right.
I mean, the speed limit's enforceable. So,
Yeah.
but when we're in neighborhoods, typically
Yeah.
what we find is we don't find a lot of cars going over 30, but in most neighborhoods 30 is probably too fast to start with, and I think that's where the discussion comes
Yeah.
of what could be a safety improvement that you could do in neighborhoods. Now, Councilmember Coughlin's right. The reason we do speed studies is people drive what they're comfortable to drive, and that's been found to be the safest way to establish speed limits. Residential areas, though, we don't do speed limits in those. Those are just a straight across the board statutory speed limit, which
Yeah.
is
Throughout
not
the whole
in most
state.
cities. I think Iowa and Wisconsin it's 25. So
Illinois is 25, Massachusetts is 25.
25 in a couple states.
So,
I don't think it,
are you okay with, it doesn't hurt to.
Well, it doesn't hurt to
Yeah.
put it on our legislative and say we advocate on behalf of it, or if it's.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And
Thank you.
I don't have
Okay.
a problem with it, absolutely. It's just-
Okay,
it's-
so there's one against it, so we're moving, one not a supporter. And for me, it doesn't hurt.
buddy.
Yeah, it doesn't-
And the thing is, if we can slow it down, I think that would help. My hope is that as our residents hear us tonight, if they all would be very conscientious and just slow down, then we wouldn't have to have all these laws.
it is our number one traffic safety complaint is just speed limit
In neighborhoods.
residential areas.
Well, there you go. I don't want to underestimate the influence that Burnsville has. We join that MLC deal. Who knows who will jump on the bandwagon?
That's true.
Yeah. And then the metro, yeah, and we'll bring it to MLC
Yeah.
when we have our legislative agenda.
Yeah, good.
Yeah.
Thank you.
We'll bring it to MLC.
Thank you.
Okay. So, and then the next item on our agenda is members of the council. On Monday, our press release went out, and we have a wonderful company here in Burnsville who started here in Burnsville and is now a national company and soon to be international, has agreed to the naming rights to the Performing Arts Center. And what we need to do tonight is to direct staff to begin that work with VenueWorks, because that's a lot of work, but that means signage. And when you have signage, then it goes before, they have to get bids out, they have to work with Ames and all of that before, then once that happens, it has to go to the HOC Design Review Committee to look at the sign. Then it has to go to the EDC. Does it have to go, or just the Planning Commission?
Planning Commission. It would
Oh,
have to
does
go
it also
but
have to go to the
Burnsville Performing Arts.
BPAC?
We would we would probably recommend that it go through the
It
BPAC
needs to
commission.
go through the BPAC because they're the commission for the performing arts. So design review, BPAC, planning commission, and then to us. With our protracted process, council, probably November before I mean, look at it, so we need to direct staff, Mary?
Well, first of all, Madam Mayor, I really want to congratulate you because it was your long, hard work and your wonderful relationship you had with the donor. Do you want to name the name?
Well, it's already out in the open
Okay,
because it
with
was
the
on
Ames
the
company.
the press, yeah.
But I know that truly it was through your persistence and graciousness that they gave this to the city, and thank you very much for that. But the other thing I want to say about that is that the process, and that is that it's a long process, but it's a good process, and I think that a lot of eyes are going to look at this, and I think that that all those eyes represent the community as a whole,
Yeah.
and I think that it will be very good.
And I think it's for us to thank the Ames family and the Ames company for their
Very much.
dedication and loyalty to this community. Bill?
Well, first of all, very deep congratulations to you for all your hard work in making it happen, and even more importantly, as you said, very deep congratulations to the Ames. So I don't know if there's anybody else. There's probably a couple others that could afford to do it. Very few people, very few companies could afford to do it, and they really did step up, and what a wonderful name that will be attached to the BPAC. So congratulations at every level.
Thank you. And I think for them, it's been struggling about, when you put your name on something, you want people to know that they are, it's a winning product. And they do that because they care about this community, and they've seen that the Performing Arts Center has done well in going through the recession and where it's at now. They also recognize the decisions that we have made in terms of the management company and moving
Person who
forward.
runs it.
Yes, and the
Yes.
people who run the Venue Works, and to Brian, thank you. A strong team. It's like any investment anybody makes, whether it's a stock market. You look and you say, who's the management company and who are the people who are sitting and making all those decisions? Are they making good decisions? And do I want my name affiliated with that?
Absolutely.
And they see that and they trust us and they know that, and they always have given back to this community in many ways, but not just to Burnsville, but to every community in Dakota County and across the country where they're located. And you'll see all of the things that they've done. Big supporters of the University of Minnesota. So, and all of that. Dan?
Well, to Butch and Richard, this is phenomenal. It's ever since I saw the Ames Arena in Lakeville, I've always been a little jealous of Lakeville having that arena provided by the Ames family, and they really have done a lot for Burnsville already up to this. And I'm so happy that they chose to do it so they can put their name on it, even though they're bashful and they're very humble. Some of the they're the salt of the earth, and they're wonderful people. I used to rent from them for many years in one of their office buildings. They're awesome. So congratulations to you too.
Yeah.
That is that's not an easy deal to do, and they respect you and have a tremendous amount of respect and admiration for you, and that's part of the reason that they chose to do it as well as the city. So,
Oh, thank you.
Congratulations.
They love the city. They started here. They found their roots here, and they want to give back. And so, and that's the thing is, they give back over and over again.
They do.
Last year, they supported that hospital,
mhm.
and it was because of their contributions that triggered the expansion. So it's not just to the city, it's to the hospital and on and on and on. So
They're great
they're
people.
great people.
They certainly
It'll be
are.
a great brand for the facility. New
Yes,
brand,
forever.
new
I mean,
movement
forever.
forward. Yeah. 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 Okay.
Did I?
So then, Ms. Johnston, you have direction for you and your staff to move forward?
Madam Mayor, thank you. We will proceed with any works, and we will get started on that, all of the different processes. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Okay. The next is the HOC Design Review Committee vacancy. Yeah.
I'm for directing staff
Yes.
to consider directing staff to conduct a limited recruitment to fill a vacancy.
Okay. All right, everybody. Okay.
Yes, I agree, but Madam Mayor, why don't you just make a pitch while we're on
Yes.
televised and
We need-
for what this is?
Yes,
Yeah.
we need someone from our community that's a resident member to volunteer to be part of the HOC Design Review Committee. And so if you're listening and you want to, we have a vacancy that we didn't fill.
And we
this
have a
last
project
summer.
right away.
We have a project to work on right away. So, and then you have some folks that came in May, and maybe you can take a look
Yeah.
at them as well.
Well, and
Ms. Brooks.
if I just may add, I served on that for a while as a liaison from
From
the
the
Planning
Planning
Commission. It's really, really interesting, and we've got some things going down in the heart of the city right now, so there's work to be done, and we need one more person to help,
Yeah.
so.
And Michelle?
Yes, Madam Mayor, we did get some applications, quite a few applications in for commissions, but we did not get any that asked to be placed on this committee specifically.
So maybe, yeah.
Madam Mayor, if people are interested, they should contact either myself or Michelle Brooks, our city clerk, so she can get the names. We'll also be contacting the current members of the committee to see if they have some recommendations. And of course, if you all have recommendations or others who are listening, please let us know, and then we can have an expedited process for you all.
Call City Hall, ask for Michelle Brooks or Heather Johnston, our city manager. Okay, very good. Now, reports. Bill, do you have any?
I don't. Heather, for the meeting I missed, is there anything that you think of as important?
Madam Mayor, Councilmember Coughlin, we reviewed the initial pieces of the legislative agenda, but I don't think that there's anything in particular I'd highlight. We spent a lot of time talking about the levy limits, actually, so.
Mary?
Nothing to add. Metro Cities Housing and Economic Development has had one meeting. LMC Policy Committee for Improving Local Economies has had one meeting. There really aren't any new issues on their agenda, so we're just going to have our second meetings. I don't expect anything really radical being added. That's all I have. Nothing else going on in particular.
Suzanne?
Well, I'm going to defer to Mr. Albrecht. He attended the meeting for the LMC Improving Service Delivery, and I
were on
tried.
vacation.
Well, actually, I did the go-to meeting, and it wasn't very successful. We had trouble with the audio, and so it was very difficult to follow. So
They had trouble at ours as well, so
Did
don't
you?
feel bad. Mm-hmm.
it was.
They did.
I wish
They
I
lost
had
some people,
been
yeah.
able to attend because it
Yeah.
was difficult. And
Yeah.
no video made it even harder to follow. So.
Okay.
Our one item that we are working on is we're working on trying to get some changes to the rules that pertain to daycares, as those pertain to strip malls and startups. It's very foggy in the state statutes how our building officials are supposed to sign off on these, what they're supposed to enforce for those types of things. So Burnsville did propose that related to our legislative initiative where we have residential care and some different care things involved. So we are moving forward with that. That's the one item that Burnsville is trying to work on. We've got a coalition of building officials that in the South Metro that are pushing for some, it's a clarification of the rule. It's not new legislation. There's just some gaps in the existing state rule that are problematic for our building officials.
Are we taking up the same thing in
Yes,
general
it's
government? That's what-
exactly
yeah,
the-
at our
the-
first
that's
committee
the
meeting,
Yep.
Steve brought this point up and put it out for that committee to adopt and put some language together, and I think you were actually going to
Yep,
throw something
we've got
together.
that, and I think we're also piggybacking on that, some of the concerns about daycares in residential areas where there is no one actually living in the home. We're looking, that legislation, the league actually has put together some stuff that we're going to work on with them on that too. So.
Okay, Dan?
Well, MBTA, there's nothing really new to report after the big grand opening of the Red Line in Apple Valley on Cedar Avenue. Suburban Transit Authority had a meeting that I could not make, but I'll be at the next one. It's really preparing for next year's legislative agenda. Metro Cities Policy, as you just mentioned, we had our first meeting, and the next one is Monday. My turn to drive.
Okay.
And so we're just kind of nailing down the specific policies, but I think the most there was 3 or 4 things that really hit on Burnsville that crossed over our particular legislative policy. So it was a pretty engaging committee, as transportation usually is. Garage has not met over the summer, but that's coming up soon. Cedar Avenue Corridor Advisory Committee, I've never attended a single meeting. I don't think they've ever had one since I was assigned it. I'm not sure why that exists. I-35 Solutions, I have an update from Ryan that I'll just briefly go over, and then I would like to talk about that particular committee. They did a final version of the Alliance's priority projects map. That's part of the legislative agenda. The Alliance's Metropolitan Council member Steve Elkins was a guest and discussed that council's policy plan updating that is occurring. In a nutshell, they're trying to remove some of the silos that they have. Oh, novel. They want their water, sewer, transportation, planning, land use, economic development plans to all mesh together better. For example, in some cases, the water plan may be dramatically opposed to the land use plan in a given area, but they don't mesh and talk to make sure this doesn't happen. So they're trying to remove those issues. And lastly, we had a bit of a discussion on trying to obtain more revenues for transportation, trying to look at the project priority map. The only project even remotely closely funded in the Minnesota River is the Minnesota River Bridge replacement in 2020, which is a project that no one is asking for, but we are getting for preservation of the existing system. Anything that is expansion on our plan is not funded. This is occurring throughout the state. So it's the same old news with transportation funding. So I have what I want to propose tonight is this particular committee meets, and it's a great committee. I've been on it a long time. I served with Dan when he was assigned to it as his liaison, and I went to him. They have a broad scope. They work very closely with the MnDOT, and so the presentations, the people that come and speak it's very informative. You learn a lot, and it's a very enjoyable committee. Unfortunately, I have a chronic conflict at work Thursday mornings, almost every Thursday morning, but 2 or 3 out of the month, and they always hit on this, and it's not something I can change because it's an all-company conference call that I actually lead. So I wanted to ask tonight if, and actually just ask for the council's support that Councilmember Sherry take my place on the I-35. She has offered to take my place in previous and showed interest in it.
And I'm the alternate, so
Yeah,
I'd be
she's
happy.
alternate, so.
And, yeah, that's,
I can do it if you want.
Ryan needs somebody else to show up with him because I've left him all solo too many times.
I'd like to make a motion that Mary get appointed
as the lead.
as the lead and that Dan
Could be the alternate.
If I'd be happy to, and I'll just
Okay.
stay in the loop because I'm in the other transportation stuff. But
Yeah. Okay.
yeah, it's unless something
You're
seriously
the alternate, we're just flipping it.
Yeah,
sounds good.
Sure.
yeah. So Dan, would you make sure that I get the background of it?
Yep.
Yeah.
I-
Yeah.
I'll
We'll
give
have
you-
Ryan.
It's
Ryan's
just by
ready to take care of that.
consensus.
I'll give
It
you my
doesn't need
folder.
a,
It's
it
about
doesn't need a motion. It's just by
Okay.
consensus. We just agree upon ourselves
fine.
who's going to do what.
Yeah, just it should be switched in all the communication,
Yeah.
and then
Michelle has got it.
notify I-35 to put
She's
her
got
on
it.
the email
Okay.
list.
Thanks.
Okay, anything else?
That's I'd be remiss if I didn't at this point in time because it's getting close. Community announcement. The fire muster is coming, obviously. We don't have another work session until after it. The Heart of the City 10K to benefit the Kids Feeding Kids and the Boys and Girls Club was moved from Sunday to Saturday morning at 8 o'clock. The 10K starts at 8, the 5K at 8:05, or a few minutes after. And then the 1K fundraise is right after the awards at 10:15.
Where's the route?
The route's have they
Moved.
The same
finalized?
route as last
Same
year.
route as last year. Yeah, it's a certified route, so runners attending this get credit for their points toward the can't remember what they call that, but there's a circuit where they get points through. This year, we've added something new. There's in the 5K, we have 10 kids from the Boys and Girls Club that are going to come down, and they'll be sponsored. Their running or their race will be sponsored by a mentor, and I'm one of those. And we'll be running with those kids in the 5K, or jogging, or asking them to slow down because I can't go that fast because my knees are killing me. So anyway, we'll have quite a few kids there, and then there'll be a group of kids at the finish line, which we had last year, which welcome the runners as they come in and cheer and clap for them and all kinds of fun stuff. So a little twist in it, added a little bit of something, and we're really gearing up in a major way right now. The committee is to promote it and work through the racing, the runners circuits, the stores, and the Anderson Race Management, which has been hired for the second year to run it. They set up the finish line and certify the course and everything. So I think it's going to continue to grow as a bigger and bigger part of the Fire Muster, and the Fire Muster board has been wonderful to work with, and they've embraced it, and there's all kinds of things we're talking about for next year already. So it's a great event. So it's a Fire Muster plug, and it's a Heart of the City 10K plug.
Okay, very good. All right. Regional Council of Mayors, we met on Monday, and we had two great presenters and a lot of great dialogue. We had Commissioner Charlie Zelli from MnDOT, and he talked about the corridors of commerce and what we need to do in our state for us to continue to be competitive, and also talked about transportation funding and what we need to do with regard to that package from the state level, and of course with what needs to happen on the federal level. So really wonderful that he had a great video, because he comes from the private sector, and this new video has got A to B, and how do you get from A to B on all different modes of transportation and all of that, but how do we also then get to the funding piece, which is really nice. And there was a lot of great discussion around all of that. And then the next one was Jeff Himmel, who is the executive director for the airport, and what's going on there, and the expansion, how the airports run, and everything. I think it would be wonderful if we invited Jeff to come and speak to us, or just not at a work session, probably bring other cities together and our staff to just really understand the airport and how all of that works. And that was the most educational and well-done piece. I mean, looking at the connection between the airport and our economic vitality, and as a hub. And what's happening with the airline business and how their airlines are merging and so forth.
Didn't we have somebody from the MAT come maybe about 3 years ago?
That
just
was-
talking about their
Yeah,
expansion
with Chad
plans.
Levick.
But not tying in with what you're saying, but it was just that expansion idea, which I think was quite interesting.
Yeah, and I think this would be something if you...
Yeah, I'd love to do that.
Yeah, so I'll talk to Apple Valley and see if they're interested, and I know that Janet Williams said that they'll get their counsel, but I think it's just good for all of us to really have him come and understand all of that. Then the other is that the Convention and Visitors Bureau. Very quickly, we adopted our compensation policy, and we modeled it after the policy we have here. So, but, there's only 2 employees. But it's always good to have a policy in place so we know what's going on and everybody knows what's happening. And then we opted to exercise our extension lease agreement with the city at the BPAC. And I think that's already been talked about, and that's done. So, and then we went through all of the issues around the strategic plan and gave staff direction. And then, of course, everybody on the board gave staff direction to explore a country fest for the summer. because we need to fill 1 month.
A what fest?
Country West.
Country fest.
Oh, you weren't here when we were at our retreat. How do we continue to drive business to, because its mission is to drive business to the destination, and Burnsville is the destination. So Canvas and Vines wasn't the revenue source on Canvas and Vine continues to dip. So what's something else that could bring in more revenue and drive people to the destination? So a country fest. So we gave staff direction to explore what other country fest is going on, what would that mean? So we're giving them
Bee
direction.
Fest, it's massive.
Yeah, but
Sucks about a third of the population of the state
Yeah.
up around Detroit Lakes for a weekend.
Yeah, but but that's much bigger. We're just small. So, and the other is that the Star report came back again, and our hotels are doing wonderfully.
Awesome.
So, average daily rates are up, and their occupancy rates are up. So all of that is good.
Excellent.
And then, of course, it just so that you all know, at the federal level, I've been reappointed to the Local Government Advisory Council to advise the EPA administrator. And this is a congressional statutory. So I'm back there, and I'm on 2 standing committees. One is water. So thank you, Heather and Steve, because we need to make sure that any of those decisions on the federal level don't have a negative impact on us. And the other one is air quality. So, and then I'm also on the LUAC, but I'll pass on the LUAC. We're working on all these things, and thank you to Steve. He's working. It's water, stormwater, water, all of these other things. And then Jenny has helped also on some of the issues that have to do with long-term planning and land use. So, okay. Michelle, you have anything?
I have nothing.
Heather, you have anything?
Nothing further.
Dana?
Nothing further.
Steve? You, okay? Then we stand adjourned. Thank you very much, everyone.